Tonight, we are traveling back 66 million years to a world that felt permanent. At that time, the land that would become North America was quiet and green. Rivers wound through floodplains, forests stretched toward distant mountains, and moving through it all, unhurried, were the dinosaurs. They had been here for over 100 million years, generation after generation, living and dying in the same valleys, along the same rivers, beneath the same slow changing sky. By this point in Earth's history, they were not struggling, they were not fading. The fossils from these final layers show animals in their prime healthy growth rings, stable populations, full biological lives. Some of these animals lived closer to our time than to the first dinosaurs that ever walked the earth. Nothing about this world suggested it was about to end. North America looked different then. A shallow sea stretched down the center of the continent, splitting the land in two. Different species lived on either side, separated by warm water, evolving along their own quiet paths. The land we walk today still holds their bones, pressed into stone, waiting to be read. Scientists have spent decades studying these final chapters, and what they've found is surprising. But what did the last days of dinosaur rule in America actually look like? And why did an ecosystem at its height vanish without warning? Tonight, we'll walk gently through that ancient world. We'll meet the creatures who lived in those last green valleys. But before we begin, if these gentle journeys bring you peace, a like or subscribe would mean the world to me and help others find their way here too. And if you're feeling cozy, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from tonight and what time is it there? It's always great to see how far this little sleepy corner of science reaches. Now take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders relax, and together let us step softly into the world of the last dinosaurs to rule America. As the story moves deeper into this ancient world, the reason North America carried so much life begins to feel almost inevitable. The continent did not simply host dinosaurs, it supported them with a quiet consistency that allowed abundance to become normal. During the late Cretaceous, this land rested in a band of the planet where extremes rarely lingered. Cold did not settle long enough to starve the soil, and heat did not arrive with the violence that strips landscapes bare. Seasons existed, but they moved gently, more like familiar breaths than sharp turns. Year after year, the climate returned to patterns life had learned to trust, and that reliability shaped everything that followed. Moisture traveled easily across the continent, guided by surrounding seas and carried inland by slow-moving weather systems. Rainfall came often enough to keep rivers full, but rarely with the force that scours ecosystems away. Instead, water spread outward across floodplains, laying down thin layers of sediment that refreshed the land rather than exhausting it. These floodplains became some of the most productive environments on Earth, rebuilding themselves with every cycle. When rivers shifted their courses, they did not leave ruin behind. They left opportunity, newly exposed ground rich with nutrients, ready to support another generation of growth. Plant life responded by filling every available space. Forests stretched across lowlands and climbed into foothills, forming layered canopies that captured sunlight at every height. Ancient conifers stood alongside flowering plants that had learned to grow quickly and recover just as fast. Ferns and ground cover spread beneath them, holding moisture in the soil and preventing erosion. Along rivers and coastal plains, vegetation renewed itself so reliably that loss became temporary, never permanent. Even disturbance served life here, opening gaps for new growth instead of erasing what came before. For herbivorous dinosaurs, this meant food was not a limiting factor, but a constant presence. Vast herds could move slowly through the landscape without stripping it bare, grazing in ways that allowed plants to rebound behind them. Young animals found enough nourishment to grow steadily, while adults maintained enormous bodies without exhausting the land that fed them. The bones left behind preserve this story quietly. Growth lines remain even and uninterrupted, signaling years that passed without famine, without sudden stress, without long recovery. These animals were not surviving on the edge of scarcity. They were living within systems that could carry them comfortably. Predators, too, fit into this balance. North America did not host a single dominant hunter surrounded by collapse, but a layered network of carnivores that occupied different roles within the same stable web. Large predators thrived not because prey was reckless or weak, but because prey was abundant enough to sustain loss. Injuries healed, populations replenished. The rhythms of hunting and avoidance became part of the landscape itself, written into repeated paths across floodplains and familiar crossings along rivers. These were not territories shaped by desperation, they were places shaped by long familiarity. The physical structure of the continent reinforced this stability. Mountain ranges rose gradually in the west, influencing rainfall patterns without severing ecosystems. Coastlines shifted with slow patience, giving life time to adjust rather than forcing sudden retreat. The inland sea that divided the continent moderated temperatures, spreading warmth and moisture across wide regions and softening seasonal extremes. Even geological change moved at a pace that life could match, allowing ecosystems to reorganize without collapsing. Over time, this consistency allowed specialization to deepen. Dinosaurs did not need to reinvent themselves to survive. Instead, evolution refined what already worked. Teeth adapted to particular plants. Body shapes balanced strength with efficiency. Defensive structures grew not as desperate shields, but as stable solutions in long-running relationships between predator and prey. These animals were not racing toward innovation. They were settling into roles perfected over millions of years. This is why the fossil record from this period feels so full. It captures a world not in decline, but in motion, continuing as it always had. Nesting grounds appear alongside feeding areas. Tracks overlap without chaos. Bones show lives that reached maturity and often old age. Death occurred, but it did not ripple outward into collapse. The system absorbed loss and continued, unchanged in its fundamentals. At the height of dinosaur rule, North America was not a land straining under its own weight. It was a continent in balance, tuned to support immense bodies and dense populations without urgency or warning. Life here did not feel temporary. It felt established, reliable, and quietly enduring, and for a very long time, it was. Over time, the shape of North America began to change in a way that was slow enough to feel ordinary, yet profound enough to quietly redirect the path of life. The land did not fracture or tear. Instead, water crept inward. Sea levels rose gently, carried by distant changes across the planet, and a shallow ocean spread down the heart of the continent. What had once been a continuous expanse of forests and floodplains became two long shores facing one another across warm inland waters. This body of water, calm and broad, reshaped North America without violence, simply by being present. The western interior seaway was not a narrow channel. It stretched from the far north to the southern reaches of the continent, wide enough that land animals could not cross it, shallow enough to glow with life beneath its surface. Sunlight filtered easily through its waters, supporting blooms of plankton that fed fish, reptiles, and great marine hunters that moved silently below the waves. Along its edges, coastlines shifted back and forth with the seasons, creating marshes, deltas, and barrier islands that blurred the boundary between land and sea. This inland ocean did not interrupt life, It reorganized it. To the west of the seaway lay Laramidia, a long, narrow strip of land pressed between the rising mountains and the inland sea. Though smaller in width than the continent had once been, it became one of the most biologically intense places dinosaurs had ever occupied. Rivers ran parallel to the coast, feeding lush lowlands that supported dense populations. The limited space did not reduce diversity, it concentrated it. Species lived closer together, adapting to specific niches within shared landscapes. Over time, even closely related animals began to diverge, shaped by subtle differences in terrain, food, and competition along this extended corridor of life. To the east lay Appalachia, broader and quieter, stretching toward the ancient Atlantic. This landmass held older mountains worn smooth by time, with forests that had grown and regrown for ages. Rivers here moved slowly toward the sea, carving valleys that changed little across generations. Compared to Laramidia, Appalachia felt spacious and steady, less crowded, less pressured. Dinosaurs here followed their own evolutionary paths, shaped by isolation rather than intensity. Some lineages persisted with fewer changes, while others developed traits unseen in the West, responding to environments that favored endurance over competition. The seaway ensured that these two worlds rarely touched. With no land bridge between them, populations remained separated for millions of years. Animals born on one side would never see the other. This isolation worked quietly, not through sudden shifts, but through time itself. Traits that proved useful in one region became more pronounced there, while remaining absent across the water. Horns curved differently, body sizes drifted, feeding strategies refined themselves to match local plants and terrain. Even behaviors likely diverged, passed down not through instinct alone, but through learned patterns repeated across generations. This separation turned North America into a natural experiment, unfolding at a planetary scale. Two communities evolved side by side, sharing the same sky and climate trends, yet never exchanging members. The result was not duplication, but divergence. The continents supported parallel worlds, each complete in its own way, each shaped by the same slow processes acting on different starting points. Life did not rush to adapt, it adjusted gradually, guided by isolation rather than disruption. Dinosaurs walked beaches where marine reptiles surfaced offshore. Carcasses carried by rivers fed scavengers from both realms. Sediments settled gently at the bottom of the inland sea, recording pollen from distant forests, alongside shells and bones from open water. These layers would later become some of the clearest records of this divided world, preserving evidence of two ecosystems evolving in parallel. As centuries folded into millennia, the separation became normal. Laramidia and Appalachia were no longer halves of a whole, but distinct lands with their own rhythms. Dinosaurs born into this world inherited not only bodies shaped by evolution, but boundaries shaped by water. The continent no longer told a single story, it told two, written at the same time in different landscapes, under the same quiet sun. The land did not know it was divided. Life continued on both sides with the same steady confidence, unaware that isolation was slowly crafting differences that would one day help scientists read this ancient world with surprising clarity. The seaway flowed between them, calm and unassuming, carrying the long memory of a continent that had learned to live apart. West of the inland sea, the land narrowed and lengthened, forming a living corridor that stretched from what would one day be Alaska down to the warmth of ancient Mexico. This place came to be known as Laramidia, though to the animals that lived there it was simply home. Pressed between the rising mountains to the west and the shallow sea to the east, the land felt contained, yet it was never cramped. Rivers traced long paths along its length, carrying water and sediment southward, stitching together valleys, floodplains, and coastal lowlands into a single, continuous world. Because Laramidia was narrow, life within it became concentrated. Ecosystems layered tightly against one another, forests giving way to open plains, wetlands dissolving into river deltas, then returning again farther down the coast. Animals did not spread outward across a wide continent, they moved along it. Over time, this created a landscape where encounters were frequent, interactions repeated, and ecological relationships grew complex and deeply established. Predators and prey learned each other well, not through sudden conflict, but through generations of familiarity written into instinct and behavior. The steady climate that had already shaped North America found a particular expression here. Warm air from the inland sea met cooler currents drifting down from the north, producing predictable rainfall that fed the long chain of rivers. These waters refreshed the soil again and again, keeping plant life abundant across the corridor. Forests thickened along riverbanks, while open areas supported vast feeding grounds. Food rarely vanished entirely from any region, allowing large animals to remain rooted in familiar territories rather than roaming in desperation. Within this setting, diversity flourished. Herbivorous dinosaurs evolved into a wide range of forms, each tuned to a specific way of feeding. Some carried massive frills and horns, not simply as defense, but as signals woven into social life. Others grew long, balanced bodies suited for steady movement between feeding areas. Still others developed beaks and teeth shaped for particular plants that thrived only in certain soils or along certain waterways. These animals did not compete blindly. They partitioned the landscape with quiet precision, sharing space without erasing one another. Predators mirrored this diversity. Large hunters occupied the top of the food web, their presence shaping the movement and behavior of entire herds. Alongside them lived smaller carnivores, faster and more flexible, hunting different prey or scavenging what remained. Each filled a role refined over countless generations. Bite marks preserved in bone and healed injuries reveal encounters that ended not in collapse, but continuation. Life here was not brittle. It bent, adapted, and carried on. Laramidia's richness is one reason it has become so deeply studied by scientists. Over time, the land that once formed this corridor experienced cycles of burial and exposure that favored preservation. Rivers laid down sediments that gently covered bones, tracks, and nests, protecting them from decay. Later, slow uplift and erosion revealed these layers again, often with remarkable clarity. In many places, the land opened its memory willingly, offering bones still arranged in the positions of living bodies, footprints frozen mid-step, and nesting grounds preserved as quiet circles in stone. The length of Laramidia also allowed scientists to read change along its spine. Species appeared in one region, then subtly shifted as their relatives occupied landscapes farther north or south. Variations in horn shape, body size, and skull structure trace these movements, showing how even within a single narrow landmass, evolution responded to distance and environment. Laramidia was not uniform from end to end. It was a gradient, alive with regional character. What emerges from this record is not a picture of chaos, but of balance sustained under pressure. Many large animals lived here at the same time, more than most modern ecosystems could support. Yet the system held. Predators remained numerous without exhausting prey. Herbivores grew large without stripping the land bare. Plants rebounded year after year, fed by soil renewed through river and flood. Everything moved within limits that had been quietly tested and reinforced across millions of years. Laramidia was not remarkable because it was fragile. It was remarkable because it worked. This western kingdom of dinosaurs thrived within boundaries set by water and stone, turning constraint into structure. Life here grew dense, varied, and enduring, unfolding along a narrow strip of land that carried one of the most complete and vivid records of dinosaur life ever left behind. The land remembered its inhabitants carefully, holding their story close, layer by layer, as time continued its slow, patient work. East of the inland sea, the land followed a quieter path. While the western corridor gathered attention through abundance and exposure, Appalachia lived beneath long stretches of patience. This eastern half of the continent did not lack dinosaurs. It lacked the conditions that would one day preserve their presence clearly. Life here unfolded beneath forests that had already grown old, across landscapes shaped more by wearing down than by building up. Time moved differently in this place, smoothing edges rather than revealing them. Appalachia was broader and less confined than the lands to the west. Its terrain rolled gently, shaped by ancient mountains that had risen long before and were already sinking back into the earth. Rivers moved slowly, carving shallow valleys and carrying sediments steadily toward the distant Atlantic. These waterways rarely flooded with the force needed to bury bones quickly. Instead, they transported remains away, scattering them or grinding them down long before stone could seal them into memory. Because of this, the fossil record here is thin, broken, and uneven. Bones were exposed rather than covered, weathered rather than protected. Forest soils, rich with plant life and moisture, encouraged decay. Roots pushed through remains. Insects and microbes worked patiently. What little survived long enough to be buried was often disturbed again by shifting water or erosion. Over millions of years, entire chapters of life were quietly erased, not by catastrophe, but by persistence. Yet even in scarcity, traces remain. Fragments of bones, isolated teeth, and rare trackways hint at a community unlike the one preserved in the West. The dinosaurs of Appalachia followed their own evolutionary paths, shaped by isolation and stability rather than crowding. Some lineages retained older traits that had faded elsewhere. Others developed features unseen in Laramidia, responding to forests that favored maneuverability over size and to environments where endurance mattered more than dominance. These animals lived among dense woodlands and broad river systems, moving beneath canopies that filtered sunlight and softened the landscape. Herbivores here likely fed on different mixtures of plants, browsing rather than grazing, adapting to vegetation that grew taller and closer together. Predators followed quieter strategies as well, navigating through shadowed terrain rather than open floodplains. Life did not need to advertise itself here. It blended into its surroundings. What scientists have recovered from Appalachia feels like listening through a wall. Each fossil is a brief sound, a single note in a much longer song. A tooth reveals the presence of a hunter. A bone fragment suggests a body shape no longer fully known. Footprints pressed into ancient mud record a passing moment, then fall silent again. These pieces do not form complete skeletons or dramatic scenes. They offer glimpses, enough to confirm life, but not enough to outline it in full. The absence itself becomes part of the story. Erosion worked steadily across eastern North America long after the dinosaurs were gone. As mountains wore down, sediments that might have held fossils were carried away rather than stacked and sealed. Later geological uplift exposed what little remained, allowing wind, rain, and ice to continue their quiet removal. Unlike regions where layers built upward and protected the past, Appalachia was a place where time kept opening the ground instead of closing it. This process did not favor preservation, it favored forgetting, and yet the land still speaks softly. Chemical traces in sediments, patterns in river deposits, and the rare survival of bone all suggest that Appalachia was not an ecological backwater. It supported full food webs, complex plant communities, and dinosaurs well adapted to their surroundings. The difference lies not in what lived here, but in what was allowed to remain. The story exists, but much of it has already been carried downstream, grain by grain, into the sea. In this way, Appalachia reminds us that Earth's history is unevenly kept. Some places remember in detail, others remember only in outline. Neither is less real. They simply experience time differently. The eastern forests sheltered life generously, but they did not protect its remains. So Appalachia becomes a world inferred rather than displayed, a place where dinosaurs walked beneath trees that left little trace of them, a land whose story survives not in abundance but in absence, shaped by erosion's long patience. Its silence is not emptiness. It is the sound of time continuing to move, long after the ground chose not to hold what once passed across it. As the landscape of North America settled into its familiar rhythms, the largest animals within it continued their lives without hesitation. The giants were still present, not as relics lingering at the edge of time, but as active participants in a world that continued to support them. Tyrannosaurus rex moved through river corridors and forest margins with the same authority it had known for generations. Triceratops traveled in groups across open ground and wooded edges, its heavy body balanced and purposeful. Edmontosaurus gathered in numbers that turned valleys into moving patterns of muscle and hide. These animals did not behave like survivors of a fading age. They behaved like residents of a system that still worked. Their presence was not rare. In the final layers of rock laid down before the end, their remains appear again and again, woven into sediments shaped by ordinary processes rather than disaster. Tracks pressed into ancient mud show steady movement, not frantic flight. Bones lie among plant debris and river deposits that speak of routine floods and quiet seasons. Nothing in these settings suggests a world already in retreat. Life continued at full scale, supported by the same landscapes that had carried it for millions of years. The bodies of these animals tell the same story. When scientists examine their bones closely, slicing thin sections that reveal internal structure, they find records of growth written in living tissue. Inside the dense walls of limb bones, patterns emerge that resemble the rings of a tree. These growth lines mark seasons past, years accumulated, pauses and surges shaped by environment and biology. In the giants of the final age, these patterns remain consistent and strong. Growth continued late into life. Tissue shows signs of active metabolism, not stagnation. These were animals still building bone, still repairing damage, still investing energy in their bodies. Tyrannosaurus rex, often imagined as a symbol of raw dominance, shows no sign of physical decline in these records. Its bones reveal strength maintained through adulthood, with dense structures built to withstand immense stress. Injuries appear, but many show healing, evidence of survival and recovery rather than collapse. This predator did not weaken toward the end. It remained fully integrated into its role, supported by prey populations that had not yet vanished. Triceratops tells a similar story from the other side of the ecological balance. Its massive skull and sweeping frill grew and changed across its lifetime, reflecting both growth and social signaling. Bone tissue within these structures shows active remodeling, a sign of continued health. Individuals reached maturity and lived beyond it, long enough for wear to appear on teeth and joints. This was not a species failing to reproduce or survive. It was one maintaining stable generations within a functioning landscape. Edmontosaurus adds another layer to this picture. As a large, adaptable herbivore, it depended directly on the productivity of its environment. Its bones preserve long, steady growth histories that reflect reliable access to food. In some individuals, growth continued almost uninterrupted, suggesting seasons that delivered what was needed year after year. Herd behavior inferred from fossil groupings points to social stability rather than fragmentation. These animals moved together, fed together, and likely raised young in settings that still offered protection and abundance. What emerges from this evidence is not a final surge before extinction, nor a slow decline masked by momentum. It is continuity. The giants of North America were still walking, still growing, still participating in ecosystems that showed no sign of imminent failure. Their bodies carried the quiet confidence of animals shaped by success, not by desperation. Bone histology, the study of these internal structures, acts like a private diary kept by the skeleton. It records stress, recovery, and growth without interpretation or exaggeration. In the final chapters of dinosaur life on this continent, that diary remains calm. There are no widespread signs of starvation etched into bone, no abrupt halts in development shared across populations. Instead, there is variation, individuality, and resilience, the marks of a living community rather than a dying one. These giants did not know they were nearing the end of their long tenure on Earth. Their bodies did not prepare for disappearance. They continued to invest in strength, size, and endurance, trusting the world that had always supported them. The land still fed them, the seasons still returned, the rhythms of life still held. So they walked on, heavy footsteps pressed into soil that had not yet learned it would soon fall silent. As the great animals continued their steady lives, another kingdom quietly held everything together. It did not move across valleys or leave footprints in mud, yet it shaped every path taken and every body sustained. The plant world of late Cretaceous North America had reached a point of remarkable maturity, spreading across the land with confidence and variety. These were not fragile or transitional landscapes. They were complete systems, layered, resilient, and deeply intertwined with the lives that depended on them. Flowering plants now dominated much of the continent. Their presence was subtle at first glance, woven into forests and floodplains rather than standing apart, but their influence reached everywhere. They grew quickly, recovered after disturbance, and diversified into countless forms. Broad leaves captured sunlight efficiently. Seeds traveled by wind, water, and animal movement, allowing plants to colonize new ground with ease. Where older plant groups persisted, they did so alongside these newcomers, forming mixed communities that balanced stability with renewal. Forests reflected this balance clearly. Tall trees formed wide canopies, filtering light into shifting patterns that changed with the seasons. Beneath them, flowering shrubs filled gaps once left open, while ferns and low plants spread across the forest floor, holding moisture close to the soil. Fallen leaves and decaying wood fed layers of life beneath the surface, enriching the ground year after year. These forests did not grow in isolation. They blended outward into wetlands and open plains, creating soft boundaries rather than sharp edges. Wetlands formed wherever rivers slowed and water lingered. Here, plant life grew dense and tangled, rooted in saturated soils that rarely dried completely. Flowering plants thrived in these settings, sending up stems and leaves that stabilized banks and slowed erosion. Their growth shaped water flow, creating quiet pools and channels that supported insects, fish, and amphibians. For dinosaurs, these areas offered reliable feeding grounds and shelter, places where food returned even after seasonal flooding. Along the coastal plains, plant communities adapted again. Salt-tolerant species spread across low ground near the inland sea, while farther inland, grasses and low shrubs covered broad stretches of open terrain. These plains shifted gradually with sea level and sediment, but plant life followed closely, adjusting without collapse. New ground rarely stayed bare for long. Roots arrived quickly, anchoring soil and preparing it for the return of larger growth. For herbivorous dinosaurs, this plant richness meant more than abundance, it meant choice. Different species fed at different heights, on different textures, and at different times of year. Some browsed leaves from trees and tall shrubs. Others cropped low-growing plants or stripped softer growth from wetland edges. Teeth and beaks matched these preferences precisely, shaped by long familiarity with specific foods. The plants, in turn, responded to this pressure. Some grew tougher leaves, others invested in rapid regrowth. The relationship unfolded slowly, balanced and enduring. This diversity of plant life allowed dinosaur populations to spread out rather than concentrate. Herds did not need to exhaust one region before moving on. They followed seasonal changes in growth, drifting between forests, wetlands, and plains as conditions shifted. Young animals learned these patterns early, guided by adults and by the land itself. Migration, when it occurred, followed rhythms set by plant cycles rather than urgency or loss. Even predators felt the influence of the plant kingdom. Dense vegetation shaped hunting strategies, offering cover and constraining movement. Open plains favored pursuit, while forests favored ambush. Wetlands slowed both hunter and prey, turning speed into patience. The structure of the plant world determined where encounters happened and how they unfolded, quietly directing the flow of energy through the ecosystem. Plants also shape survival in less visible ways. Their roots stabilize soil, reducing erosion and maintaining riverbanks. Their growth influenced local climates, cooling air and retaining moisture. Their decay fed microorganisms that kept nutrients circulating. This hidden labor supported everything above it, from the smallest insect to the largest dinosaur. When conditions shifted slightly, plants absorbed the change first, softening its impact before it reached the animals. By this late stage in Earth's story, the plant kingdom was not a background feature, it was the foundation. Dinosaurs thrived not simply because they were large or well adapted, but because the landscapes beneath them were productive, forgiving, and deeply interconnected. The green world did not struggle to keep up with its inhabitants. It had grown alongside them, learning the same rhythms, responding to the same slow changes. Forests, wetlands, and coastal plains continued their quiet work season after season. Leaves unfolded, seeds scattered, roots deepened. And across this living tapestry, dinosaurs moved as they always had, supported by a plant kingdom that still held strong, unaware that its long reign of stability was nearing a sudden and unimaginable end. As attention turns from living landscapes to the quiet testimony of stone, the story remains unexpectedly calm. The rocks beneath North America hold long, layered records of time, stacked gently one upon another, each formed during ordinary moments rather than moments of crisis. These layers do not speak of a world unraveling, they speak of continuity. Sediment settled year after year along rivers, floodplains, and coastal margins, burying traces of life without interruption. Footprints pressed into soft ground, nests shaped in sand, bones left behind by animals that lived full lives, all became part of an unbroken sequence that leads directly to the final boundary. In these layers, dinosaurs do not thin out or retreat. Their presence remains steady, woven consistently through the stone. Species appear where they are expected to appear, in the environments they had long occupied. Herbivores continue to dominate plant-rich regions. Predators remain tied to the movements of their prey. The arrangement of fossils reflects functioning ecosystems rather than fragmented ones. There is no emptying of habitats, no narrowing of diversity, no long silence creeping in before the end. This continuity stands out most clearly when layers are read slowly, one above the other, like pages turned without haste. Earlier forms do not vanish to make room for a diminished cast. Instead, familiar shapes persist. Horned dinosaurs, duck-billed herds, large predators, and smaller companions all continue to leave their marks. Tracks cross the same floodplains across multiple layers. Bone beds show repeated use of landscapes rather than abandonment. Even delicate remains, which would be among the first to disappear if conditions worsened, continue to appear. What makes this record remarkable is not simply what is present, but what is missing. There is no gradual fade-out, no long decline where species become rare, then rarer still, before disappearing. The number of dinosaur species in North America does not steadily shrink as the boundary approaches. Instead, diversity holds. New individuals continue to grow, move, and die in ordinary ways. The fossil record carries them forward with quiet consistency, right up to the final line where everything changes. For many years, scientists expected a different story. Based on how extinctions often unfold, it seemed reasonable to assume that dinosaurs were already struggling before their disappearance. Gradual environmental stress, slow climate shifts, or long-term ecological imbalance might leave signs of decline etched into the rocks. In many other extinction events, these signals appear clearly. Species thin out, body sizes shrink, ecosystems simplify, but North America refused to follow this pattern. Instead, the evidence suggested a world holding steady. This realization did not arrive all at once. It emerged slowly, as more sites were uncovered and more layers examined. Each new discovery added weight to the same quiet conclusion. Dinosaurs were not vanishing in stages across the continent. They were present, active, and diverse until the very end of their geological chapter. The expected warning signs were simply not there. This surprised scientists deeply, not because the extinction itself was unexpected, but because its timing now seemed profoundly mismatched with the condition of the world it ended. The dinosaurs of North America were not limping toward disappearance. They were not reduced to isolated refuges. They were not clinging to survival in shrinking habitats. They were part of landscapes that still functioned, still supported complexity, and still produced abundance. The boundary, when it arrives in the rock record, is sharp. Below it, life continues in familiar patterns. Above it, the dinosaurs are gone. There is no long slope between the two. The transition is not gradual. It is sudden, decisive, and unmistakable. This sharpness stands in contrast to the calm that precedes it, making the loss feel all the more striking in hindsight. What the rocks reveal is not a story of inevitability, it is a story of interruption. The stability preserved in these layers forces a shift in understanding. Extinction here was not the final act of a failing system. It was an external break imposed upon a world that, by all measurable signs, was still working. The land had not exhausted its potential. The ecosystems had not collapsed under their own weight. The dinosaurs had not reached a natural endpoint. they were stopped. And the rocks, patient and precise, remember that difference. Time in this world moved in circles rather than lines. Long before the final boundary approached, the land of North America followed a steady rhythm shaped by the turning of seasons. Warmth returned, then softened. Rains arrived, then withdrew. Plants grew, rested, and grew again. These changes were not sudden or severe. They unfolded with a reliability that life learned to anticipate, and the dinosaurs lived within this pattern as comfortably as breathing. The evidence for these seasons is carried quietly inside bone. When the great animals of this age grew, their bodies recorded time layer by layer. Inside their limbs, thin bands formed as bone tissue shifted its pace across the year. During times of plenty, growth moved quickly, laying down dense, healthy structure. When conditions slowed, perhaps during cooler months or drier periods, growth eased and left a faint line behind. These lines accumulated patiently, marking each passing year without drama. They are not scars of hardship, they are signatures of rhythm. Across many species, these patterns repeat with remarkable consistency. The spacing between growth rings remains even. The pauses are brief and predictable. There is no sign of prolonged stress, no irregular gaps that would suggest sudden disruption. Instead, the bones show animals growing in step with their environment, responding to seasonal shifts that returned on time, every time. Life adjusted, then continued. These yearly cycles shaped how dinosaurs moved through the land. As seasons changed, so did the distribution of food and water. Rivers swelled gently during wetter months, spreading nutrients across floodplains. Plants responded with fresh growth, drawing herbivores into open areas where feeding was easy and abundant. When conditions shifted again, animals followed the quiet signals of the land, drifting toward forests, wetlands, or coastal plains where resources remained reliable. Movement was not frantic, it was learned, repeated, and passed down across generations. Young dinosaurs grew up within these rhythms. Their earliest years were shaped by predictable change, by times of expansion and rest that followed familiar patterns. As they matured, their bodies adapted to this cycle, growing stronger during periods of abundance and slowing naturally when the environment asked for patience. This balance allowed individuals to reach full size without exhausting themselves or the land that sustained them. Predators followed the same seasonal cues. As herds shifted position, hunters adjusted their territories. Certain valleys became more active at particular times of year. River crossings gained importance during migrations. Forest edges turned into hunting grounds when prey gathered beneath sheltering canopies. These patterns repeated often enough to become part of the ecosystem's memory, shaping behavior without conscious awareness. Life flowed along paths worn not just into the ground, but into habit. The stability of these seasons is especially clear in what the bones do not show. There are no widespread signs of interrupted growth, no sudden thinning of tissue across populations, no shared markers of extreme stress. Instead, variation appears only where it should, between individuals, ages, and species. Some grew faster, others slower, but all moved within the same gentle framework of annual change. The land did not surprise them, it kept its promises. This predictability extended beyond temperature and rainfall. Day length shifted gradually across the year. Plant cycles responded in turn, flowering, seeding, and resting with dependable timing. Insects emerged. Small animals followed. Every layer of the ecosystem moved together, like parts of a single, slow mechanism. Dinosaurs lived within this system, not above it. their lives shaped by repetition rather than disruption. Even injuries and illness reflect this rhythm. Healing marks in bone suggest recovery over known spans of time, not desperate survival under constant pressure. An animal could be injured in one season and return to full strength in the next. The environment allowed for repair. It allowed for patience. What emerges from this record is a picture of deep familiarity. Dinosaurs did not inhabit a world of constant uncertainty. They lived within predictable cycles that shaped growth, movement, and behavior. Seasons came and went, not as threats, but as structure. Time itself felt organized, divided into chapters that repeated with reassuring consistency. In the final age, life still trusted the calendar written by the planet. Bones recorded the passing years with calm precision. Landscapes responded as they always had. Dinosaurs continued to grow, age, and move in step with rhythms that had guided them for millions of years. The world turned, the seasons followed, and life kept pace, unaware that this long pattern was nearing its quiet end. Within the living systems of late Cretaceous North America, predators did not exist at the edge of balance. They stood firmly within it, shaped by long success and supported by landscapes that continued to provide. At the center of this network moved Tyrannosaurus, not as a lone symbol of power, but as a stabilizing presence woven into the fabric of life. Its role reached far beyond the act of hunting. Wherever it walked, the structure of the ecosystem adjusted around it, refined by familiarity rather than fear. Tyrannosaurus functioned as a keystone species, one whose influence shaped many others without needing constant dominance. Its presence guided the movement of herds, influenced where animals fed, and determined which individuals survived long enough to reproduce. Herbivores remained alert, mobile, and responsive, preventing overuse of any single area. Weak or injured individuals were removed before disease or overgrazing could spread. The predator did not destabilize the system. It tuned it, maintaining balance through selective pressure applied steadily over time. The physical record preserves this relationship in quiet detail. Bite marks appear on bones across the continent, not scattered randomly, but patterned in ways that reveal intent and success. Teeth left impressions that match the shape and spacing of Tyrannosaurus jaws, sometimes deep and final, other times shallow and healed. Many prey animals survived attacks, their bones knitting back together over months or years. These healed wounds tell of encounters that did not end in collapse, but in continuation. Predator and prey met often enough for injury to become part of life, not an ending. Such healing requires time and resources. It requires food available after injury, water within reach, and environments that do not demand constant flight. The survival of wounded animals speaks to ecosystems, still capable of absorbing loss without unraveling. Predation occurred, but it did not empty the land. Instead, it flowed through it, predictable and contained. Tyrannosaurus itself shows the marks of this stability. Its bones carry evidence of stress endured and repaired, fractures healed cleanly. Muscle attachment sites remain strong, shaped by repeated use rather than decline. The animal did not weaken toward the end of its lineage. It remained capable, active, and deeply embedded in its role. This was not a predator surviving on borrowed time. It was one operating at full capacity. Around this apex hunter lived other carnivores, each filling a different space within the same system. Smaller predators hunted young animals, scavenged remains, or specialized in particular environments. They did not disappear in the presence of a giant. They adapted around it, forming layers of predation that spread pressure across the ecosystem rather than concentrating it. This diversity reduced instability. When one pathway faltered, another carried the flow of energy forward. The absence of ecological collapse is most clearly seen in what does not change. Prey species remain abundant in the fossil record. Growth patterns continue uninterrupted. Herd structures persist across layers of stone. If predators had overwhelmed their environment, signs would appear quickly. Bones would thin out. Growth would slow. Landscapes would empty. None of this occurs. Instead, the record shows persistence, repetition, and renewal. Predators at the peak of power do not need to consume recklessly. They rely on continuity. Tyrannosaurus hunted within limits, shaped by instinct and environment, not excess. Its success depended on prey populations remaining strong enough to sustain future generations of hunters. Over time, this relationship became self-reinforcing. The predator shaped the prey, and the prey shaped the predator, both evolving within boundaries that kept the system intact. Tracks preserved in ancient mud suggest purposeful movement rather than chaotic pursuit. Paths repeat across generations, hinting at territories maintained and understood. These animals did not wander blindly across the land. They moved with memory, guided by experience inherited through behavior as much as biology. The world they inhabited rewarded this knowledge. Nothing in this record suggests a system under strain. Predators did not increase in number as prey declined. They did not turn to desperation. They did not vanish early. They remained present, effective, and stable until the very end. The balance they maintained was not fragile. It had endured for millions of years, reinforced by repetition and adaptation. In the final age, predators stood exactly where evolution had placed them. They were neither too many nor too few. They hunted, healed, aged, and died within ecosystems that still functioned as intended. The land continued to support them, and they continued to shape the land in return. Power, here, was not a warning sign. It was evidence of stability, written quietly into bone, track, and stone, carried forward by a world that had not yet learned it was about to change forever. Across the wide floodplains of late Cretaceous North America, the ground itself became a quiet witness to motion. Soft sediments received weight again and again, pressing memories into mud that later hardened into stone. These trackways stretch across ancient surfaces in long, overlapping lines, not scattered or chaotic, but organized and purposeful. They reveal animals moving together, bodies aligned in shared direction, feet falling into rhythms shaped by familiarity with the land. Movement here was not random, it followed paths learned and remembered. Many of these tracks appear in groups, parallel impressions preserved side by side. The spacing between them suggests animals of different sizes traveling at the same time. Larger footprints anchor the pattern, while smaller ones cluster nearby, close enough to be sheltered without slowing the group. This arrangement hints at herds composed of adults and young, moving as a unit rather than as individuals. The land did not simply host passing animals, it carried entire communities forward, step by measured step. Seasonal change guided much of this movement. As plants shifted their growth across the year, herds adjusted their positions accordingly. When floodplains greened after seasonal rains, animals gathered to feed on fresh growth. As water levels changed and vegetation thinned, they drifted toward forests, wetlands, or coastal plains where resources remained steady. These journeys were not vast migrations across continents. They were regional movements, repeated often enough to become tradition. Paths worn into the ground were followed again and again, reinforced by generations that learned where abundance returned. The predictability of these movements speaks to a world that kept its schedule. Rivers rose and receded within known bounds. Plains renewed themselves with reliable timing. Dinosaurs did not need to search desperately for food. They moved when the land invited them to move, guided by cues written into the environment. This allowed herds to remain cohesive, avoiding fragmentation that often follows uncertainty. Trackways sometimes cross and merge, forming dense networks that suggest gathering points used repeatedly over time. These places likely offered reliable water, shelter, or feeding grounds that drew animals together across seasons. At such sites, the ground records moments of convergence, many feet arriving, pausing, then departing along familiar routes. The land remembers these gatherings not as singular events, but as recurring patterns woven into its surface. Social behavior emerges gently from these traces. The presence of multiple age groups moving together implies care beyond simple proximity. Young animals kept pace within protective circles. Larger individuals may have positioned themselves along the edges of groups, creating living barriers against danger. While bones cannot record sound or intention, the arrangement of tracks and bodies suggests coordination shaped by long association rather than chance. Fossil sites reinforce this picture in quieter ways. Bone beds containing multiple individuals of the same species often preserve a range of ages. These animals did not simply die together by accident, they lived together. Their remains reflect shared space over extended periods, whether at feeding grounds, watering sites, or seasonal shelters. The repetition of such sites across regions suggests social structures that endured, carried forward through learned behavior rather than instinct alone. Migration and movement also shaped the broader ecosystem. As herds traveled, they influenced plant growth, trampling some areas while fertilizing others. Their passage opened spaces for new plants to grow, maintaining diversity across the landscape. Predators followed these movements with patience, learning when and where prey would appear. This dance between movement and response unfolded slowly, reinforcing balance rather than disrupting it. The physical record shows no sign of panic in these patterns. Tracks remain evenly spaced, paths remain consistent. There is no sudden scattering, no abrupt change in direction repeated across sites. Instead, the land records continuity. Animals moved because it was time to move, not because they were fleeing loss or collapse. Their behavior reflects trust in rhythms that had guided them for countless seasons. Even the smallest details support this steadiness. Some trackways preserve moments where animals paused, shifted weight, or turned slightly without breaking formation. These subtle marks suggest awareness of others nearby, adjustments made to remain together. Movement here was social, shaped by group needs rather than individual urgency. Through these traces, herds and their journeys become visible not as dramatic migrations, but as everyday life unfolding across familiar ground. The land carried these animals gently, allowing their stories to overlap and repeat. Footsteps layered upon footsteps, seasons upon seasons, until motion itself became part of the geological record. In this final age, dinosaurs moved with confidence, shaped by memory. They followed paths learned long before, traveled with companions they recognized, and trusted landscapes that continued to offer what they needed. The ground beneath them accepted each step without resistance, holding their passage quietly, unaware that these familiar rhythms were approaching their last turning. As rivers carried their steady load of water and sediment toward the inland sea and the distant ocean, the land softened into wide margins where earth and water met. These coastal regions were neither fully terrestrial nor fully marine. They shifted with tides, storms, and seasons, forming deltas, lagoons, barrier islands, and low plains that were always in motion. Dinosaurs lived here not as visitors, but as residents who had learned to move with a landscape that never stayed still for long. Along these shorelines, plant life grew thick and fast. Salt tolerant vegetation spread across muddy flats, while farther inland, forests leaned toward the water, their roots binding soil that might otherwise wash away. Channels split and rejoined, creating mosaics of land that changed shape over years rather than days. Dinosaurs adapted to this instability, with bodies and behaviors suited to balance and flexibility. Many moved in groups, crossing soft ground together, following routes that shifted gradually rather than disappearing all at once. Fossils from these regions preserve a blended world. Dinosaur tracks appear alongside ripple marks left by waves. Bones rest among shells, fish remains, and the traces of marine reptiles. This mingling does not suggest confusion, but coexistence. Coastal dinosaurs lived close to the sea, feeding on plants nourished by marine-influenced soils and drinking from waters shaped by tides. Some species likely timed their movements to avoid flooding, while others took advantage of newly exposed feeding grounds left behind as waters withdrew. The boundary between land and sea created opportunities as well as challenges. Nutrients from rivers enriched coastal waters, supporting dense marine life. Fish gathered in shallows. Invertebrates flourished in tidal zones. Carcasses that washed downstream became food for scavengers from both realms. Dinosaurs feeding near these margins lived within a wider web of energy exchange, one that linked forests and floodplains to open water. The ecosystem here extended beyond what could be seen from shore, drawing strength from interactions that crossed environments. Evidence suggests that some dinosaurs spent much of their lives near these coastal settings. Their remains appear repeatedly in delta deposits and shoreline sediments, indicating familiarity rather than accident. These animals likely understood the rhythms of tides and storms, retreating when waters rose and returning when land reappeared. Over generations, such knowledge would have shaped movement patterns passed down through behavior rather than instinct alone. Yet this closeness to water came with trade-offs. Coastal landscapes were productive, but they were also sensitive. Small changes in sea level could redraw the land quickly. A channel that once supported vegetation could turn saline. A feeding ground could vanish beneath water for years. Dinosaurs living here depended on stability that was narrower in margin than that of inland environments. While rivers and plains changed gradually, coasts responded more immediately to shifts beyond their horizon. The sediments that preserve coastal fossils tell this story quietly. Layers stack unevenly, recording cycles of deposition and erosion. Some beds capture moments of calm growth. Others show sudden burial beneath fine sands or silts carried in by storms or rising water. These events were not constant, but they were part of life along the shore. Dinosaurs adapted to them, but adaptation required timing and awareness that could not always prevent loss. Interaction with marine ecosystems also introduced risks unfamiliar to inland species. Storm surges could push saltwater far into lowlands, altering plant communities temporarily or permanently. Changes in marine productivity could ripple back onto land, affecting vegetation and the animals that depended on it. Coastal dinosaurs lived close to a boundary that magnified disturbance, even when the broader world remained stable. This vulnerability does not mean these animals were weak or poorly adapted. On the contrary, they thrived within these margins for long periods, supported by rich resources and dynamic landscapes. But their success was tied closely to conditions that could shift more quickly than those of interior regions. The same openness that allowed abundance also reduced buffering against sudden change. Fossil distributions hint at this delicate balance. Coastal species appear well represented up to certain layers, then grow rarer or vanish in places where environments changed rapidly. This pattern reflects not gradual decline, but sensitivity to disruption in landscapes where small shifts had outsized effects. Life along the shore required constant adjustment, and when adjustment could not keep pace, absence followed. In the final age, coastal dinosaurs continued their lives as they always had, moving between water and land, feeding where nutrients gathered, and navigating terrain shaped by tides and sediment. The sea remained a neighbor, sometimes generous, sometimes demanding. The land still offered space and sustenance. But along these edges, the margin for error was always thinner. And in a world that had otherwise learned how to remain steady, the coast quietly held places where change could arrive first, carried in by water that never stopped moving. As time narrowed toward the final chapter, the world did not stand perfectly still. Even in its long stability, small changes continued to pass across the surface of the planet, subtle enough to blend into the background of daily life. The last million years of the Cretaceous were not frozen in sameness. They carried gentle shifts, slow movements, and distant disturbances that life absorbed without losing its footing. Sea levels moved slightly during this time, rising and falling in quiet cycles. Shorelines advanced and retreated by modest distances, reshaping deltas and coastal plains without overwhelming them. In some regions, shallow seas expanded inland for a while, then slowly withdrew again. These changes altered local habitats, redistributing wetlands and coastal vegetation, but they did not erase ecosystems. Inland environments continued their rhythms largely unchanged, supported by rivers that adjusted their courses with patience rather than force. Volcanic activity also left its mark, though often far from the lands where dinosaurs walked. Massive eruptions elsewhere on the planet released gases into the atmosphere and laid down layers of ash across distant regions. These events influenced climate on a global scale, but their effects unfolded gradually. Temperatures shifted within tolerable ranges. Rainfall patterns adjusted, then settled again. The land responded with flexibility learned over millions of years of adaptation. In North America, these influences arrived softened by distance and time. Ash settled lightly in some areas, enriching soils rather than suffocating them. Chemical signals preserved in rock hint at atmospheric changes, but not at sudden toxicity or collapse. The plant world continued to grow and renew itself. Rivers kept flowing. Herds kept moving along familiar paths. Predators remained integrated into their roles. What makes this period remarkable is not the presence of change, but its scale. Nothing during this final million years appears large enough, sudden enough, or widespread enough to unravel the ecosystems that had endured for so long. Species distributions remain consistent. Growth patterns in bone remain steady. Fossil layers show continuity rather than disruption. Even where environments shifted slightly, life adjusted without losing complexity or diversity. Sea level changes did not drown the continent. Volcanic activity did not poison it. Climate variations did not push ecosystems beyond recovery. Each influence acted slowly, allowing plants and animals to respond through movement, adaptation, and resilience. These were challenges life had faced before, many times over, and survived. This realization matters because it reshapes how the final extinction is understood. If the dinosaurs had already been declining due to long-term stress, the fossil record would show signs of thinning populations, shrinking body sizes, or simplified ecosystems. Instead, the record shows persistence. The same species continue to appear. The same structures remain intact. Life does not appear to be retreating from the world. It remains fully present within it. The last million years, then, feel like a quiet narrowing rather than a descent. Time continues to pass. Minor adjustments ripple across the planet, but nothing signals an ending. Nothing prepares the living world for what is about to come. This absence of warning is preserved in stone. Layers accumulate gently, one atop another, each capturing moments of ordinary life. Bones show animals growing, healing, and aging as expected. Trackways continue to cross floodplains. Plant remains suggest ongoing productivity. Even subtle chemical markers point to variation, not collapse. The Earth, in this moment, appears capable of continuing on the same path indefinitely. Because of this, no single gradual change can be isolated as the cause of extinction. Sea levels alone cannot explain the sudden disappearance. Volcanism alone cannot account for the sharp boundary that follows. Climate shifts alone do not match the abruptness recorded in the rocks. Each factor played a role in shaping the background of the world, but none pushed it beyond its limits. The land remained alive and responsive. The dinosaurs living within it did not show signs of exhaustion or failure. They did not retreat into shrinking refuges. They did not vanish region by region. They remained widespread, diverse, and active until the very end of their chapter. The final million years, then, become a study in contrast, a world still working, systems still holding, change occurring, but not accumulating into disaster. The calm before the break is not marked by silence or decay, but by continuation. Life moved forward as it always had, unaware that time was no longer offering gradual adjustment. The Earth had weathered slow change many times before. What lay ahead would not arrive slowly, and nothing in these last quiet years gave warning of the moment that would soon divide the story forever. When the final moments of dinosaur life in North America are examined closely, they do not appear dramatic or unusual. They look ordinary. The fossil record preserves animals not in panic or flight, but in the midst of everyday actions, as if the world simply paused while life was still underway. Bones, tracks, and preserved positions suggest a landscape moving through another familiar day, shaped by habits repeated countless times before. Many fossils from this final interval are found where animals appear to have been feeding. Teeth lie scattered among plant remains. Jawbones rest near the vegetation they once cropped or stripped. In some places, stomach contents are preserved as dark stains or clustered fragments, showing meals that had barely begun to digest. These animals were not starving or searching desperately for food. They were eating what the land had always provided, following routines that had sustained them throughout their lives. Other remains suggest rest rather than motion. Large herbivores are preserved lying on their sides or bellies, limbs folded beneath them in positions consistent with relaxation. Predators, too, are found in postures that imply pause rather than pursuit. These were not bodies caught mid-stride or frozen in escape. They were bodies at ease, settled into the ground in moments of stillness that followed activity. The land accepted them gently, as it had accepted countless others before. Trackways reinforce this sense of normalcy. Footprints continue across floodplains without disruption, spaced evenly and aligned with familiar paths. There is no sudden clustering, no chaotic overlap that would suggest confusion or alarm. Tracks maintain direction and rhythm, reflecting animals moving with purpose and awareness of one another. Young and adult footprints appear together, preserving the quiet order of herds traveling as they always had. In some locations, Nesting grounds remain intact up to the final layers. Eggs lie arranged in careful patterns. Hatchling remains appear near adult bones, suggesting care and proximity rather than abandonment. These sites speak of life planning for continuity, not retreat. Reproduction had not ceased. The future was still being prepared, one season at a time. The bones themselves carry no message of imminent danger. Growth patterns remain steady. Healing continues. Injuries show repair rather than failure. There are no widespread signs of malnutrition etched into skeletons, no thinning of bone that would suggest prolonged stress. Muscles had remained active enough to leave strong attachment points. Teeth show wear consistent with normal feeding rather than desperation. Bodies reflect lives lived to their expected rhythms. Even the environments surrounding these fossils tell the same quiet story. Sediments around bones show gradual deposition rather than violent disturbance. Fine layers of mud and silt settle gently, burying remains without scattering them. Plant debris lies mixed with animal remains in ways that suggest routine flooding or seasonal change, not catastrophe. The world that surrounded these animals was behaving as it always had. What is striking is the absence of preparation. No evidence suggests that animals were altering behavior in response to growing threat. There is no sudden shift toward refuges, no mass movement away from certain regions, no thinning of populations in exposed areas. Dinosaurs continued to occupy coastlines, floodplains, forests, and open plains alike. They did not retreat inland. They did not cluster into isolated pockets. They lived everywhere they had learned was safe. The record preserves moments that feel unfinished, meals interrupted, rest cut short, journeys paused midway. These are not scenes of awareness or anticipation. They are fragments of a world continuing its habits without knowledge that time was about to break its pattern. For scientists, this ordinariness has become one of the most powerful clues. Extinctions driven by long decline often leave signals of stress and adjustment. Behaviors change. Bodies reflect hardship. Ecosystems simplify. None of this appears here. Instead, the evidence points to a sudden interruption imposed upon a system that had not yet begun to fail. A normal day does not announce itself. It feels like every other day before it. That is what the rocks preserve in this final chapter. Dinosaurs waking, feeding, resting, moving through landscapes that still worked as intended, plants growing, rivers flowing, seasons continuing their gentle cycle. Nothing in bone or stone suggests anticipation. Life was still invested in tomorrow, still shaped by routines that assumed continuity. The world had not grown quiet or tense. It had not changed its rules. It had not offered warning. And so the final evidence left behind is not one of struggle or retreat, but of life carried on, steady and familiar, until the moment it could not. At a certain height within the rock layers of North America, the long continuity comes to an abrupt pause. Above this line, the familiar traces of dinosaur life vanish. Below it, the world continues as it always had. Between the two lies a boundary so thin it can be measured in centimeters, yet so consistent it appears across the continent like a quiet signature. This is the moment written in stone, not as story or speculation, but as material fact. Within this narrow layer rests an element rarely found in abundance at Earth's surface. Iridium, usually locked deep within the planet, appears here in concentrations far above the natural background. It settles evenly across vast distances, from inland plains to coastal regions, embedded within sediments that otherwise show no reason to contain it. The land did not produce this material on its own. It arrived from elsewhere, falling gently but decisively onto soil, water, and living things alike. The iridium layer does not sit alone. Mixed within it are grains of quartz that bear the marks of extreme force. Under magnification, their internal structures appear fractured in precise patterns that form only under sudden, intense pressure. These crystals did not grow this way over time. They were shocked into new shapes in an instant, their orderly interiors rearranged by energy far beyond any ordinary geological process. Alongside these grains lie tiny spheres of glass, smooth and rounded, scattered like frozen droplets. They formed when rock was heated beyond melting, then flung upward and outward, cooling rapidly as it fell back to Earth. Each sphere is a record of transformation. Solid stone briefly turned liquid, then returned to solid form before it could lose its shape. These particles settled across the landscape, mingling with ash, dust, and debris in a thin, unmistakable band. Together, these materials speak with unusual clarity. They do not suggest gradual change or slow accumulation. They do not resemble sediments laid down by rivers or seas across long periods. They point instead to a sudden event, one that delivered heat, pressure, and foreign material across an entire continent in a span of time too short to be recorded in layers. The rocks preserve this moment without embellishment, holding it exactly where it occurred. What makes this boundary remarkable is its precision. Below it, bones, tracks, pollen, and shells appear as expected. Above it, the dinosaurs are gone. There is no mixing, no blurring of signals. The division is clean. Life did not fade through this layer. It stopped, then resumed in a different form on the other side. This sharpness transformed understanding. For many years, explanations of extinction leaned toward slow decline, toward systems wearing themselves down over time. But this layer offered a different story. It showed that the end arrived as a physical interruption, not a drawn-out conclusion. The evidence did not come from a single site or region. It appeared again and again wherever the boundary was preserved. Different landscapes, different sediments, same signal. The land itself recorded the event without awareness or intention. Rivers continued to deposit sediment. Lakes settled dust from the air. Coastal waters trapped particles as they sank. Across all these environments, the same materials appear at the same relative moment. This consistency allows the boundary to be traced like a line through time, connecting places that were once separated by thousands of kilometers. Nothing in this layer suggests survival or adjustment. There are no footprints crossing it, no bones resting partly above and partly below, no gradual return of familiar forms immediately afterward. The world above the boundary is quieter, simpler, reshaped. But that story belongs to later chapters. Here, the focus remains on the moment itself. The iridium, the shocked quartz, and the glass spheres do not explain consequences, they simply testify. They mark the arrival of something sudden and overwhelming, something capable of altering the planet at once. The rocks do not speculate, they do not dramatize, they preserve. In this thin seam of stone, time tightens. Millions of years of steady life press against an instant of disruption. The continuity that carried dinosaurs through seasons, migrations, and generations meets a boundary it could not cross. The Earth did not signal this moment in advance. It recorded it afterward. And so the moment remains, fixed in place, waiting quietly beneath our feet. After the thin line in the rock marks the moment of arrival, the effects begin to spread outward, carried not by wind or flame, but by the solid earth itself. The ground beneath North America did not remain still. Energy moved through it like a deep, powerful breath, traveling faster and farther than any surface disturbance. Seismic waves surged away from the source, rolling through bedrock, plains, mountains, and basins, reaching regions that had no view of the sky where the event began. These waves bent and flexed the crust as they passed. In some places, the shaking was strong enough to fracture stone that had rested undisturbed for millions of years. In others, it loosened sediments laid down by rivers and seas, turning firm ground briefly unstable. The land did not split open dramatically everywhere. Instead, it softened, shuddered, and shifted, responding to forces far beyond anything it had known before. Along waterways and lowlands, this motion had immediate consequences. Saturated soils lost their strength and began to behave like liquid. Sand and mud flowed, lifting objects that had once been firmly anchored. Trees tilted, riverbanks slumped, buried layers mixed together, blurring boundaries that had once been clear. This process, known through its effects rather than its name, left behind warped and folded sediments that still record a moment when the ground forgot how to be solid. Water responded as well. Lakes, rivers, and inland seas did not remain calm when the earth moved beneath them. Seismic energy displaced water suddenly, sending waves racing outward from shorelines. These were not ocean-spanning walls of water, but powerful surges that swept across deltas, floodplains, and low-lying coasts. In confined basins, water sloshed back and forth, overtopping banks and carrying debris far inland before retreating again. Evidence of these inland tsunamis appears in unexpected places. Marine sediments are found layered over freshwater deposits. Shells from shallow seas rest above soils that once supported forests. In some regions, large blocks of sediment were ripped up and redeposited elsewhere, out of sequence with the slow accumulation that usually shapes the land. These layers do not repeat over long spans of time. They appear suddenly, then vanish, marking a brief interval when water moved with unusual force. What makes these signals striking is their distance from the original source. The impact did not need to be nearby for its effects to arrive. Seismic waves traveled efficiently through the continent, delivering energy to regions thousands of kilometers away. Places that would never receive falling debris still felt the passage of that force beneath their feet. The earth itself became the messenger. Far from the impact site, rocks preserve signs of sudden disturbance that do not fit local causes. Slumped layers appear in otherwise calm sedimentary sequences. Liquefied sands intrude upward into overlying beds, frozen in place when motion ceased. River systems show evidence of abrupt reorganization, channels filled or redirected in ways that suggest momentary chaos rather than gradual change. These features are not scattered randomly through time. They cluster tightly around the same boundary marked by iridium and shocked minerals. Above and below that level, the land returns to familiar behavior. Sediments settle normally. Rivers resume their slow work. Stability returns. This brief interval of disruption stands out precisely because it is so short. The animals living on this land would have experienced these effects without understanding their cause. Herds on floodplains would have felt the ground ripple beneath them. Forests would have swayed without wind. Water would have risen where it had never risen before, then withdrawn just as suddenly. These were not changes that unfolded over seasons or years. They arrived within minutes, perhaps hours, carried by the movement of the planet itself. Yet even here, the evidence remains quiet rather than theatrical. There are no grand scars carved across the continent. Instead, there are subtle signs, preserved where conditions allowed, waiting to be noticed by careful eyes. The Earth recorded the passage of energy in folded layers, displaced sediments, and mismatched deposits, then moved on. What emerges from these records is a sense of reach. The impact was not a local event with distant consequences. It was a continental experience, delivered through stone and water as much as through air. North America felt it as a whole, from coast to interior, from lowland to high ground. When the shaking stopped and the waters settled, the land remained altered in small but meaningful ways. The evidence lies far from the place where everything began, scattered across the continent like echoes that arrived after the sound itself had faded. After the shaking passed and the waters settled back into their channels, the sky became the next messenger. Material launched high above the planet did not vanish into space. It returned. Fragments of rock and melted debris, thrown far beyond the atmosphere, began to fall back toward Earth. As they re-entered, they met the air at tremendous speed, and in doing so, they transformed it. The upper atmosphere warmed rapidly, not from a single flame, but from countless points of friction. Each returning fragment carried heat, and together they spread it across vast regions. The effect was not localized to one horizon or one coastline. It unfolded overhead, turning the sky itself into a source of warmth. For a brief span of time, the air glowed with energy, radiating heat downward onto the surface below. This heat did not arrive as a slow change. It came swiftly, pressing down across forests, plains, and wetlands alike. Leaves dried, needles curled, grasses lost their moisture. The landscapes that had supported life so reliably were suddenly primed to burn. Ignition did not require lightning or prolonged drought. It required only the conditions that now existed everywhere at once. Fires began to spread. They did not move as isolated blazes sparked by chance. They emerged across wide areas, igniting vegetation already prepared by heat and dryness. In some regions, flames raced through forests, climbing trunks and leaping between canopies. In others, ground fires crept across plains, consuming grasses and low plants before moving on. Wetlands that once resisted fire briefly dried at the surface, allowing burns to reach places that rarely experienced them. These fires were not sustained forever. They burned intensely, then exhausted their fuel. What they left behind was not a barren planet, but a transformed one. Ash settled into soils. Charred plant material drifted into rivers and lakes. The land absorbed the residue of this brief but widespread burning, folding it into the layers that would one day become rock. Evidence of these fires remains preserved across North America. Thin bands, rich in charcoal, appear within sediments laid down immediately after the boundary. Under magnification, these particles reveal burned plant matter, reduced to carbon but still retaining cellular structure. They are not the product of a single forest fire or a localized event. They appear across many regions, embedded in different environments, carried by wind and water before settling. These charcoal layers act like a quiet census of loss. They record vegetation burned almost simultaneously across large areas, then transported into the geological record. Rivers carried ash downstream. Lakes trapped it in settling sediments. Floodplains received it during seasonal overflow. In each case, the signal is the same. Fire touched the land broadly, then withdrew. The falling debris continued to arrive even as the fires burned. Tiny glassy particles and dust rained down, mixing with ash in the air and on the ground. The sky dimmed as material accumulated, but before darkness fully took hold, heat had already done its work. The burning phase was short, but its reach was wide. For animals living through this moment, the world would have changed rapidly. Heat pressed from above, smoke filled the air, familiar scents of vegetation were replaced by the sharp trace of burning. Some regions may have escaped direct fire, shielded by moisture or geography. Others did not. But even where flames did not pass, the effects of heat and ash arrived indirectly, carried by air and water. The rock record captures this sequence with restraint. Charcoal appears, then fades. Ash layers thin out. Sediments return to patterns shaped by water rather than fire. The burning was intense, but it was not endless. The planet did not remain aflame. It moved on to the next phase of adjustment. What matters is not only that fire occurred, but when it occurred. These charcoal layers sit tightly bound to the same boundary, marked by foreign elements and shocked minerals. They do not repeat throughout the layers below. They do not appear gradually. They cluster around the moment when the atmosphere briefly became an engine of heat. Fire here was not a separate disaster. It was part of a chain. Re-entering debris warmed the air. Heat dried the land. Vegetation ignited. Ash and charcoal settled. Each step followed the last without pause, driven by physical processes rather than chance. The rocks preserved this chain without commentary, holding each piece in place long after the flames went out. When the burning ended, the land remained altered, marked by loss and residue. But the story did not stop there. The fire was a passage, not a conclusion. Its traces remain in stone, quiet and precise, waiting alongside the other signs of a world that changed not through slow decline, but through a sequence of sudden, connected moments written into the earth itself. After fires swept across the land and ash settled into rivers, wetlands, and soils, the sky itself became the final and most enduring change. Fine dust, soot, and aerosols lifted high into the atmosphere, far above the reach of ordinary weather, where they spread and lingered instead of falling quickly back to Earth. These particles did not block the sun completely, but they weakened it in a way life had never experienced. Daylight still arrived, yet it came thin and pale, drained of strength. Midday no longer carried warmth or clarity. Shadows softened, colors dulled, and the familiar certainty of the sun's presence faded into something unreliable. This loss of light did not announce itself with violence. It settled slowly, quietly, and persistently. Each day arrived slightly dimmer than expected, each sunrise delivering less energy than the one before. The land still turned beneath the sky, but the exchange that had sustained life for millions of years was interrupted. Sunlight, once abundant and dependable, became scarce enough to matter. What followed was not destruction in the dramatic sense, but interruption at the most fundamental level. Plants were the first to feel this change, though they did not fall immediately. Leaves remained green for a time. Forests still stood. Wetlands still held water. But inside plant tissues, the process that turns light into living matter slowed and then faltered. Without sufficient sunlight, growth ceased. New leaves failed to form. Flowers did not open. Seeds did not mature. What had once been constant renewal became gradual exhaustion. Plants began living on stored energy, drawing down reserves that were never meant to last long. As days passed under dim skies, the effect spread across every landscape. Forest canopies thinned without replacement. Grasses across plains stopped expanding. Aquatic plants in rivers and wetlands lost the steady productivity that fed insects, fish, and small animals. Even hardy species that tolerated shade could not endure prolonged darkness. The problem was not cold, fire, or poison. It was absence. Energy was no longer entering the system at the rate life required. This loss at the base of the food web carried consequences upward with quiet inevitability. Herbivorous dinosaurs depended directly on plant productivity, especially animals of great size whose bodies required constant intake. They could endure short shortages and seasonal variation, but this was different. Each cycle, without sufficient growth, reduced what the land could offer. Feeding grounds failed to recover. Familiar plants vanished from known routes. Even adaptable species faced a narrowing world where movement no longer guaranteed nourishment. Predators followed soon after, not because they lacked strength or skill, but because their prey weakened and dwindled. The system did not collapse in a single moment, it thinned. Each layer depended on the one below it, and as plants failed, everything above them lost support. The darkness did not need to kill directly, it only needed to persist long enough for hunger to do its work. The fossil record preserves this phase not through dramatic scenes, but through absence and simplification. Pollen grains grow scarce, plant diversity drops sharply. Sediments laid down during this interval contain fewer biological traces, reflecting ecosystems that could no longer sustain complexity. Life did not disappear entirely, but it became quieter, smaller, and more limited, waiting for conditions to change. What makes this darkness more consequential than the impact itself is its duration. The impact was sudden, powerful, and brief. Fires burned and went out. The ground shook and then settled. Water surged and returned to its channels, but the dimming of sunlight lasted long enough to interrupt the continuous flow of energy into the biosphere. Without photosynthesis, recovery could not begin. The planet entered a holding pattern where life could survive only on what already existed, not on what could be grown anew. This shift explains why even strong, well-adapted animals could not persist. Dinosaurs did not vanish because they were weak or outdated. They vanished because the foundation that supported them was removed. The collapse moved from plants to herbivores to predators, guided not by violence, but by physics and biology working without compromise. Eventually, dust and aerosols began to settle. Light slowly returned, but by then, the world had already crossed a threshold. Many plant communities were gone. The ecosystems that had supported immense animals for millions of years no longer existed. Recovery would come, but it would follow different paths, favoring smaller bodies, faster reproduction, and lower energy demands. In this way, darkness at midday became the quiet turning point. It did not roar or burn, it simply lingered, dimming the sun until the world that depended on it could no longer continue as before. As the dim sky lingered and plant growth failed to recover, the living structure that had held the continent together for so long began to loosen, strand by strand. The change did not arrive everywhere at once, and it did not look the same in every place. It moved quietly through the food web, starting at its broad base and traveling upward with steady inevitability. What had once been a tightly connected system of exchange and renewal began to thin, not from violence, but from absence. Herbivores were the first to feel the weight of this shift. Their lives had always depended on the constant return of plant matter, leaves unfolding, stems rising, new growth replacing what had been eaten. When that renewal stopped, familiar feeding grounds failed them. Valleys that once supported herds no longer produced enough nourishment. Wetlands that had offered reliable vegetation grew sparse at the surface. Even forests, which seemed unchanged at a distance, no longer replaced what was consumed. Large bodies require steady intake, and as days passed under weakened light, the balance tipped quietly against them. At first, Animals drew on reserves, fat stores diminished, movements became more deliberate as energy was conserved. Migration routes that once led to abundance now led only to slightly less scarcity. Young animals suffered earliest, their growing bodies unable to compensate for reduced intake. Reproduction slowed, then ceased. The rhythm of generations broke not with a single failure, but with many small interruptions that accumulated over time. As herbivores weakened and their numbers declined, predators found their world narrowing. Hunting success depends not only on skill, but on opportunity. Prey that had once moved in predictable patterns grew fewer and less visible. Herds fragmented as individuals fell behind or failed to recover from exhaustion. Predators spent more energy searching, traveling farther between encounters that once came easily. Even successful hunts could no longer sustain populations that had evolved within abundance. This loss of prey reshaped predator behavior, but it did not save them. The largest hunters, whose bodies required constant fuel, faced the steepest challenge. Without enough herbivores to support them, they could not maintain strength or reproduce. Smaller carnivores followed soon after, caught in the same narrowing channel. Scavenging increased briefly, drawing life from the remains of those already lost. But this too faded as fewer bodies appeared across the land. The unraveling did not move only upward, it spread outward. As animals vanished, plants that had relied on grazing to control growth patterns changed as well, often becoming dominated by a few hardy forms that could tolerate stress. Insects lost hosts and habitats. Small vertebrates struggled as shelter and food sources diminished. The complexity that had once allowed ecosystems to absorb change now worked against them as the loss of one connection weakened many others. This process is preserved in the rock record not through dramatic scenes, but through thinning signals. Bone beds become rarer, trackways grow scarce, pollen records show reduced diversity. Each layer reflects a quieter world than the one below it. The decline is not selective in the way earlier evolutionary shifts had been. It does not favor certain forms over others based on adaptation alone. It follows the logic of dependency. When energy stops entering the system, everything that depends on it must eventually yield. Cascading extinction is not a sudden collapse like a building falling inward. It is more like a river running dry from its source downward. The channel remains, but the flow weakens until movement slows to nothing. Each part of the system responds in turn, constrained by biology rather than choice. Even the most successful animals of the previous age could not escape this sequence because no amount of strength or intelligence could replace missing energy. What makes this cascade especially stark is how recently the world had functioned so well. The ecosystems of North America had supported dense populations, large bodies, and intricate relationships right up until the light failed. There was no long period of adjustment that might have favored gradual adaptation. The change arrived faster than large animals could respond. Smaller organisms, with shorter life cycles and lower energy demands, began to find narrow paths through the disruption. But for the giants, the window closed quickly. The land itself remained. Rivers still flowed. Mountains did not fall. The climate, though altered, did not become immediately hostile to all life. Yet the food web that had animated this landscape unraveled with quiet precision, each loss making the next more likely. By the time light began its slow return, the structure that had supported the dinosaurs was already gone. What remained were fragments, scattered survivors, and empty spaces where connections had once existed. The extinction did not arrive as a single blow delivered to every species at once. It moved through relationships, severing links that could not be restored in time. In this way, The end of the dinosaurs was not only an event, but a process, one that unfolded step by step as the food web loosened and finally came apart, leaving behind a world profoundly altered by the loss of what had once held it together. As the food web thinned and the flow of energy weakened, the meaning of size began to change. For millions of years, great bodies had been an advantage. Size brought reach, protection, and authority. It allowed animals to travel far, dominate feeding grounds, and endure brief hardship without immediate consequence. But in a world where energy no longer entered the system as it once had, that same size became a burden carried with every breath and step. Large animals live on narrow margins, even in times of abundance. Their bodies require constant fuel to maintain warmth, muscle, and movement. Each day demands enormous intake, not only to grow or reproduce, but simply to remain alive. When plants ceased their steady renewal and herbivores weakened, those margins vanished. What had once been manageable shortages stretched into weeks, then months. A body built for plenty could not shrink its needs quickly enough to match a world offering less. For the great herbivores, the problem was immediate and relentless. Even as they moved farther and searched longer, the landscape could no longer repay the effort. Every step consumed energy that could not be replaced. Fat reserves dwindled, muscle mass declined, young animals failed to reach maturity. Large bodies, once symbols of success, now demanded more than the land could give. Predators faced the same arithmetic from a different angle. Their survival depended on the continued presence of large prey, animals that no longer existed in sufficient numbers. Hunting large bodies requires strength, speed, and coordination, all of which carry high energy costs. As prey became scarce, predators burned precious reserves simply by searching. Successful hunts became rarer, and each failure carried greater risk. A large hunter could not survive on occasional meals alone. Its body was built for consistency, not uncertainty. In contrast, smaller species lived by different rules. Small bodies require less fuel. They heat and cool more quickly, but they also survive on far less food. A brief scarcity that proved fatal to a giant could be endured by a smaller animal through reduced activity or altered behavior. Many small species reproduced more quickly, allowing populations to recover even when losses were severe. Shorter lifespans meant faster turnover, giving evolution more opportunities to favor traits suited to the new conditions. Diet played a role as well. Smaller animals often fed on a wider range of resources: seeds, insects, detritus, or aquatic life that persisted even as plant productivity collapsed. Some could shelter underground or within dense cover, reducing energy loss and exposure. Others could enter periods of dormancy, slowing their metabolism until conditions improved. These strategies were not signs of superiority, but of compatibility with scarcity. The survival gap widened as time passed. Large animals required stability. They thrived when ecosystems delivered predictable abundance. Smaller animals could tolerate instability, adjusting behavior and biology to endure fluctuation. As darkness lingered and plant life struggled to recover, the environment increasingly favored those who asked less of it. Size, once rewarded, was now penalized. This shift was not selective in a moral sense. It did not spare the clever or condemn the slow. It followed physical laws that care nothing for legacy. Energy in equals energy out. When input fell below a certain threshold, only those with lower demands could persist. The extinction line drawn between large and small was not absolute, but it was stark. The fossil record reflects this divide with clarity. Large-bodied species disappear rapidly and completely. Smaller animals persist, sometimes in reduced numbers, sometimes altered in form, but still present. The world above the boundary is quieter and more restrained, populated by creatures whose survival strategies matched a diminished energy flow. What makes this loss especially poignant is how recently size had been an advantage. The giants of North America were not obsolete or poorly adapted. They were specialists in a world that no longer existed. Their extinction was not a judgment on their design, but a consequence of changed conditions that arrived too quickly for bodies of such scale to adapt. In time, life would rebuild. New large animals would appear millions of years later, shaped by ecosystems that once again supported high energy flow. But in this moment, during the long aftermath of darkness and collapse, size became a sentence written by physics rather than fate. The land did not choose to abandon its giants. It simply could no longer afford them. As the great collapse moved through the land and the largest bodies vanished from familiar places, life did not disappear all at once. Some lineages lingered longer than others, not because they were spared, but because they occupied narrow spaces where survival remained briefly possible. These last survivors did not represent a continuation of the old world. They were its final echoes, shaped by resilience rather than dominance, persisting where conditions allowed a little more time. Among the dinosaurs, the groups that lasted longest tended to share certain traits. They were smaller, more flexible in diet, and often capable of faster reproduction. Some lived closer to water, where food webs rebuilt more quickly from aquatic sources. Others occupied sheltered environments, forests or wetlands that retained pockets of productivity even as open landscapes failed. These animals were not thriving, they were enduring, stretching the final chapter by seasons or years rather than generations. Regional differences played a quiet role in how long this endurance lasted. North America did not experience the aftermath evenly. Some areas retained moisture longer, others saw quicker return of light or plant growth at small scales. River systems, lakes, and coastal margins created temporary refuges where food webs reassembled more rapidly, even if only partially. In these places, dinosaur remains appear slightly higher in the rock record than elsewhere, suggesting that extinction did not strike every region at precisely the same moment. These differences, however, were measured in brief spans of time. They do not indicate a slow retreat across the continent. They reflect local conditions offering momentary shelter rather than true recovery. The dinosaurs that survived longest did so within shrinking worlds, confined to pockets that could not expand or reconnect once the broader system had failed. The final non-avian dinosaurs of North America lived in landscapes already transformed. The forests they knew were thinner. The herds they once moved among were gone. The rhythms that had shaped their lives no longer returned with the same certainty. Even where food remained, it did so unevenly, forcing constant movement and adjustment. Survival became a matter of timing and luck rather than adaptation. What ultimately closed the door for these last lineages was not a single missing trait, but the accumulation of constraints. Non-avian dinosaurs reproduce slowly compared to smaller animals. Their eggs required stable conditions and time. Their young needed extended care and steady access to food. In a world where seasons no longer delivered predictable abundance, these requirements became insurmountable. Even when adults survived, populations could not replace themselves. Birds, the only dinosaur lineage to persist beyond this boundary, succeeded not because they were immune to loss, but because they crossed a threshold of flexibility. Smaller bodies, rapid reproduction, and the ability to exploit seeds, insects, and aquatic food sources allowed some birds to endure conditions that no longer supported larger forms. Flight offered escape and access, but it was not flight alone that mattered. It was the combination of low energy demands and behavioral adaptability that allowed survival through scarcity. Non-avian dinosaurs never had the opportunity to make that transition. Their bodies and life histories were shaped by a world that rewarded size, stability, and long-term investment. When those rewards vanished, their strengths became limitations. Evolution does not plan for sudden change, it refines what works in the present. When the present shifts too quickly, even successful designs can fail. The fossil record preserves this ending with restraint. Dinosaur remains grow rare, then disappear entirely. Above that point, the land tells a different story. Smaller animals appear more often. Plant communities begin to change direction. The silence left by the giants is not filled immediately. It lingers, marking the absence of creatures that had shaped the land for millions of years. The last survivors did not pass quietly because they were insignificant. They passed because the world they belonged to no longer existed. Their extinction was not a single moment, but a narrowing window that closed as energy, stability, and time ran out together. What remains is not a mystery of failure, but a record of limits. The dinosaurs of North America endured fire, darkness, hunger, and fragmentation longer than most life could have. But endurance alone was not enough to carry them through a transformed planet. When the final traces fade from the rock, they do so without spectacle. The land does not announce their departure. It simply moves on, carrying forward those forms of life whose needs matched what the earth could still provide. When the long silence settled over the land and the great bodies vanished from familiar places, one branch of the dinosaur family tree continued quietly onward. It did not carry the weight of horns or the reach of massive jaws. It moved lightly, close to the ground or into the branches above it. Birds, small and easily overlooked in the world that came before, became the living thread that carried dinosaur life beyond the boundary. Their survival was not the result of a single trait, but of a rare combination that happened to align with a changed planet. Birds were small, and small bodies asked little from a world offering less. They required less food, less time to mature, and less space to persist. Their rapid reproduction allowed populations to recover even when losses were heavy. Eggs hatched quickly, young grew fast. Generations turned over at a pace that allowed adaptation to act while conditions were still shifting. Diet played a central role. Many birds were not bound to a single food source. Seeds, insects, small aquatic life, and scattered plant material remained available even when forests failed and large vegetation disappeared. Seeds in particular became lifelines, storing energy from the last productive seasons and remaining accessible long after plant growth had stalled. Insects, too, endured in sheltered microhabitats, offering concentrated nutrition that could sustain small bodies through scarcity. Behavior mattered just as much as biology. Birds could shelter in ways larger dinosaurs could not. Some took refuge in burrows, dense vegetation, or rocky crevices. Others found safety in trees, above the reach of ground-level disruption. Flight expanded these options, not as an escape from danger, but as access to scattered resources. It allowed movement between shrinking habitats without the energy cost demanded of larger animals traveling long distances on foot. The difference between ground-dwelling and tree-dwelling species proved critical. Birds that relied heavily on open ground faced the same challenges as other terrestrial animals: exposure to cold, hunger, and disrupted landscapes. Many of these lineages vanished alongside non-avian dinosaurs. Tree-dwelling species, however, occupied vertical spaces that changed more slowly. Branches remained even when forests thinned. Canopies offered protection from temperature extremes and predators. Insects persisted in bark and leaves longer than plants survived on the forest floor. Water also shaped survival. Birds associated with rivers, lakes, and coastlines benefited from food webs that recovered more quickly through aquatic productivity. Fish, invertebrates, and algae re-established themselves sooner than large terrestrial plants, offering nourishment where land-based ecosystems lagged behind. These environments acted as stepping stones through the aftermath, allowing birds to bridge the gap between collapse and recovery. Feathers, often imagined only as tools for flight, played a quieter role. They provided insulation, helping birds regulate body temperature during periods when sunlight no longer warmed the land reliably. This ability to maintain internal warmth reduced energy loss and increased endurance. Combined with efficient respiration and high metabolic control, birds could remain active when larger animals could not. This survival, however, was narrow. Most dinosaur lineages did not make it through. Even among birds, many groups disappeared. The path that led from the world of Tyrannosaurus to the birds seen today passed through a bottleneck so tight that only a few forms could squeeze through. Survival was not guaranteed. It depended on being small enough, flexible enough, and lucky enough to exist in the right places when everything changed. The fossil record reflects this narrow escape with clarity. Above the boundary, bird remains appear sparsely at first, then grow more common as ecosystems stabilize. Their presence does not mark immediate dominance, but persistence. They did not inherit the earth overnight. They waited, endured, and gradually expanded into spaces left empty by the giants. What survived was not the image most people associate with dinosaurs. It was a quieter form, one that had lived in the shadows of larger bodies, adapted to the margins of ecosystems rather than their centers. Birds carried forward the dinosaur blueprint in a refined and reduced form, shaped by necessity rather than conquest. In this way, birds did not replace dinosaurs. They continued them. They stand as evidence that extinction is rarely absolute, and that survival often belongs to those whose needs align with what remains rather than what was lost. The living dinosaurs of America do not roar or shake the ground. They perch, glide, and sing, carrying within them a history that passed through fire, darkness, and hunger, then emerged, improbably, into a quieter world that followed. When the darkness began to lift and dust slowly settled from the sky, the land that emerged was not immediately alive in the way it had once been. North America entered a quieter phase, one defined less by presence than by absence. The familiar signs of dense ecosystems were gone. The great bodies no longer crossed floodplains. Trackways did not renew themselves. Bone beds that once recorded crowded lives fell silent. In the layers laid down after the boundary, the fossil record thins dramatically, not because time stopped, but because life had been reduced to a fraction of what it had been. This silence was not uniform devastation. It was an emptiness shaped by survival at the margins, where only a few forms could persist while the land adjusted to a fundamentally altered state. Sediments from this interval often contain long stretches with little biological variety. Where earlier layers captured complex food webs, these newer deposits hold only scattered remains. A small vertebrate here, an insect trace there. Occasional bird fossils appear, but rarely in numbers that suggest abundance. The land was not lifeless, but it was stripped of complexity. Ecosystems that had once supported towering herbivores and powerful predators were reduced to simpler arrangements, dominated by organisms that could reproduce quickly and tolerate instability. Rivers still flowed, but their banks were quieter. Plains still existed, but without herds to shape them. Forests had not yet returned in any recognizable form. Among the first signs of renewal comes a subtle but widespread signal preserved in pollen and spores. Ferns, resilient and fast growing, began to spread across disturbed ground. Their spores appear in sudden abundance in sediments across the continent, forming what scientists call a fern spike. This surge does not represent lush forests or complete recovery. It marks something more basic. Ferns are among the first plants to colonize bare or damaged landscapes. They thrive where soil is exposed, where competition is low, and where sunlight, once returned, can be used quickly. Their presence signals that the land was open, raw, and ready for regrowth, even if that regrowth was still fragile. Alongside ferns came other early recovery plants, species that could grow rapidly, tolerate poor soils, and reproduce without long delays. These plants did not recreate the layered forests of the past. They formed patchy cover, stabilizing soil and beginning the slow work of rebuilding the base of the food web. Their growth helped retain moisture, reduce erosion, and create microhabitats where insects and small animals could survive. This was not a return to abundance, but the first step away from emptiness. The animals that lived during this phase reflected the same simplicity. Small bodies dominated, diets were flexible, life cycles were short. The survivors did not attempt to rebuild the old world. They occupied what was available, adapting to landscapes that no longer supported large, specialized forms. Energy flowed again, but at a much lower rate. Each connection in the food web was fragile, easily broken, and slow to reestablish. This period represents a biological reset rather than a continuation. The extinction had removed not only species, but the structure of ecosystems themselves. Relationships that had evolved over millions of years were gone. Niches stood empty. Evolution did not rush to fill them. It proceeded cautiously, guided by what the environment could now support. The rules of survival had changed, and life responded by simplifying before it could diversify again. The silence of these landscapes was not permanent, but it was profound. It marked a pause in Earth's long story, a moment when complexity stepped back and waited. The land needed time to rebuild soils, restore plant cover, and allow energy to accumulate once more. Only then could larger bodies and more intricate relationships begin to reappear. In this quiet interval, the planet did not mourn what was lost. It adjusted. Ferns spread their delicate fronds across open ground. Small animals moved through new cover. Birds continued quietly above it all. The earth reset its living systems not through force, but through patience. From this silence, a different world would eventually rise, shaped by absence as much as by survival, carrying forward life that had learned how to begin again. When the silence began to lift and the land slowly gathered itself, North America entered a chapter unlike any it had known before. The absence of dinosaurs did not leave the continent empty, but it left it open. Vast spaces once shaped by immense bodies now lay unclaimed, their roles waiting quietly for new occupants. The change did not arrive as a sudden takeover. It unfolded gradually, guided by time, patience, and opportunity rather than competition or conquest. Mammals were among those who moved into this openness, though at first their presence was subtle. They had lived alongside dinosaurs for millions of years, mostly small, nocturnal, and easily overlooked. In the altered world that followed the extinction, their traits became advantages. Small size, flexible diets, and rapid reproduction allowed them to respond quickly to changing conditions. As plant communities stabilized and insects returned in greater numbers, mammals found reliable sources of food. They explored burrows, forest edges, riverbanks, and open ground, stepping into niches that had remained unused since the collapse. This expansion was cautious rather than explosive. Ecosystems needed time to rebuild before they could support larger bodies or complex food webs. Plants continued their slow recovery, spreading beyond ferns into shrubs and early forests. Soils deepened as roots stabilized the ground and organic matter accumulated. Insects diversified, followed by small reptiles, birds, and mammals that depended on them. Each step added another layer of stability, allowing energy to flow more freely through the system once again. Mammals responded by diversifying in form and behavior. Some became adept climbers, moving through newly forming canopies. Others specialized in digging, reshaping soil, and creating shelter for themselves and other species. A few began experimenting with larger body sizes, though none approached the scale of the dinosaurs that had once dominated the land. Growth was measured, constrained by ecosystems, still learning how to support complexity. The world rewarded flexibility over size, efficiency over dominance. Predation returned in new forms. Smaller carnivorous mammals hunted insects, reptiles, and one another. Birds continued to occupy aerial and shoreline roles, bridging aquatic and terrestrial food webs. The absence of giant predators allowed different hunting strategies to flourish, favoring stealth, speed, and adaptability. These interactions slowly restored balance, though it was a balance shaped by different rules than before. Over time, landscapes themselves began to change. Forests grew denser and more varied, composed of plant species that had evolved in the aftermath rather than the age of dinosaurs. Rivers carved new channels through soils no longer compacted by massive herds. Grasslands began to appear in places where open ground persisted, reshaping how animals moved and fed. The continent did not return to its former state. It became something new, guided by the legacy of what had been lost. This new world carried echoes of the past without repeating it. Energy levels rose, but not to the heights required to sustain giant bodies. Instead, ecosystems favored networks of smaller, interconnected species. Complexity returned, but it expressed itself differently, through diversity rather than size. Mammals continued to expand into roles once held by dinosaurs, but they did so incrementally, shaped by millions of years of gradual change rather than sudden replacement. What emerged was a North America that felt familiar in outline, yet profoundly altered in detail. The land still held forests, rivers, plains, and coastlines, but the rhythms that animated them had shifted. Movement became quicker and quieter, life cycles shortened, adaptation accelerated. The continent no longer revolved around a few dominant forms, but around many smaller ones, sharing space and influence. This rebuilding did not erase the memory of dinosaurs from the land. Their absence shaped every step that followed. Empty niches allowed mammals to rise. Altered plant communities guided new evolutionary paths. The silence left behind created room for a different kind of life to unfold. America without dinosaurs was not a diminished place. It was a place reimagined, carrying forward the long story of life under new constraints, shaped by loss, resilience, and the quiet persistence of change. As the story stretches beyond the disappearance of dinosaurs and into the long work of recovery, the rocks offer both guidance and restraint. Fossils are generous record keepers, but they are not complete narrators. They preserve moments, not continuity, and what survives is shaped as much by chance as by history. Even in North America, where preservation is unusually rich, the record is threaded with gaps that no amount of careful searching can fully close. Fossilization requires very specific conditions. An animal must die in the right place, be buried quickly enough, and remain undisturbed long enough for stone to take hold. Most life does not meet these requirements. Bodies decay, scatter, dissolve, or are consumed. Entire communities can exist for thousands of years without leaving a single trace that survives into the present. What we uncover, then, is not a full inventory of the past, but a selection filtered by geology, chemistry, and time. These gaps become more pronounced during periods of upheaval. After the extinction, environments shifted rapidly, rivers changed course, erosion accelerated. Sediments that might have preserved remains were often reworked or removed entirely. In some regions, layers from critical moments are thin or missing, erased by later processes that had nothing to do with the extinction itself. The absence of fossils in these places does not mean absence of life. It means the land chose not to remember. Geography plays a quiet role in shaping these mysteries. Western North America, with its cycles of burial and uplift, offers windows into deep time that few places can match. Eastern regions, by contrast, have been worn down rather than built up. Ancient layers were exposed, weathered, and carried away long before they could be studied. Coastal areas shifted repeatedly as sea levels changed, overwriting earlier records. What remains is uneven, a patchwork where some stories are preserved in detail and others survive only as hints. Even where fossils exist, they rarely capture behavior or experience. Bones can show growth, injury, and age, but they cannot tell us how animals reacted in their final days. We can infer movement from trackways and social structure from bone beds, yet the emotional texture of life remains beyond reach. Fear, confusion, adaptation, and resilience leave no direct imprint in stone. We see outcomes, not perceptions. Timing, too, carries uncertainty. While the boundary itself is sharp, the sequence of events within days, weeks, or months remains blurred. We know darkness followed fire, and collapse followed darkness, but the precise rhythm of loss cannot be reconstructed fully. Some populations may have endured slightly longer than others. Some regions may have offered brief refuge. These differences are suggested but not resolved. The fossil record smooths time, compressing moments into layers that resist fine detail. There are also entire forms of life that leave little trace at all. Soft-bodied organisms, small insects, delicate plants, and microbial communities shaped ecosystems profoundly, yet their presence is often inferred rather than seen. These invisible actors may have played crucial roles in survival and recovery, guiding the direction of ecosystems long after the dinosaurs were gone. Their stories exist mostly in chemical signals and indirect evidence, reminders that life is more than what hardens into bone. What may never be known is how close the world came to different outcomes. Could more dinosaur lineages have survived if darkness had lifted sooner? Could ecosystems have rebuilt fast enough to support larger bodies again? Did certain regions serve as brief sanctuaries whose evidence was later erased? These possibilities remain suspended, neither confirmed nor denied, held outside the reach of proof. This uncertainty is not a failure of science, it is an honest boundary. The strength of the fossil record lies in what it can show clearly: patterns of change, moments of interruption, and long arcs of recovery. Its limitations remind us that Earth's history is vast, beyond complete reconstruction. Every fossil is a survivor of time, and every gap is a place where time moved on without leaving a message behind. In the end, what the fossils cannot tell us is as important as what they can. They teach humility alongside knowledge. They reveal a past that is partially visible, partially hidden, and forever incomplete. The story of extinction and recovery is not missing its ending. It is missing some of its sentences, worn away by the same forces that shape mountains and rivers. What remains is enough to understand the scale of change, the fragility of dominance, and the patience of life. And what remains unknown continues to rest beneath the ground, silent not because it lacks meaning, but because the earth does not record everything it carries. As the long narrative of extinction and survival comes into focus, it becomes clear why so much of this story is told through the land that would become North America. This continent did not experience the end of the dinosaurs differently from the rest of the world, but it preserved that ending with unusual clarity. The Earth does not record history evenly, and in this case, Western North America became one of the rare places where time, geology, and circumstance aligned to keep the final chapter intact. Much of this clarity comes from how the land itself behaved before and after the extinction. During the final age of dinosaurs, large parts of western North America were shaped by rivers, floodplains, coastal lowlands, and shallow seas that deposited sediment steadily and repeatedly. These environments buried bones, plants, and tracks gently, protecting them from erosion and decay. After burial, later geological forces lifted these layers rather than grinding them away, exposing them again millions of years later in cliffs, badlands, and open basins. The result is a landscape where the pages of deep time are not only preserved, but readable. This preservation is especially strong across the boundary itself. In many parts of the world, the layers marking the extinction are thin, disrupted, or missing entirely. They were eroded away, folded beyond recognition, or never deposited in the first place. In Western North America, that boundary often remains intact, a narrow line separating two worlds. Below it, dinosaurs appear diverse and abundant. Above it, they vanish. Few places offer such a clear before and after, held together without interruption. Because of this, scientists can trace change across seasons, years, and ecosystems with unusual confidence. Growth rings in bones align with plant records. Trackways connect movement to environment. Charcoal, pollen, and sediment tell parallel stories that reinforce one another. This convergence allows patterns to emerge that would remain uncertain elsewhere. The story becomes not only about extinction, but about how extinction unfolded across real landscapes filled with living communities. America also matters because it captures the final phase of dinosaur life at its peak. The continent supported some of the most diverse and densely populated dinosaur ecosystems on Earth right up until the end. This makes the absence that follows more meaningful. When dinosaurs disappear here, they do so not after a long retreat, but after success. The contrast sharpens the lesson written into the rock, showing that dominance offers no protection against sudden planetary change. What we learn from this clarity extends far beyond one continent. The process is recorded in American stone, impact signals, fire, darkness, ecological collapse are echoed across the globe. They appear in marine sediments, polar ice cores, and distant continents, even where fossils are scarce. The difference is that in North America, these signals can be linked directly to living systems, showing how global forces translated into local consequences. This connection allows scientists to test ideas about mass extinction in ways that would otherwise remain abstract. The sequence preserved here shows how energy loss propagates through ecosystems, how food webs respond, and why certain traits favor survival under extreme stress. These insights apply not only to dinosaurs, but to life as a whole. They help explain other extinction events in Earth's history and inform how modern ecosystems might respond to rapid change. America's role in this story is not one of importance by chance alone. It is a reminder that understanding deep time depends on where the Earth chose to keep its memories. The land did not intend to preserve this record. It simply happened to be in the right place, shaped by forces that favored burial, protection, and later exposure. The result is a rare archive of planetary change written across hills and plains. In reading this archive, the story of the dinosaurs becomes more than a tale of loss. It becomes a lens through which the fragility and resilience of life can be seen clearly. The final days of dinosaur rule are not preserved everywhere, but where they are, they speak with unusual honesty. Through America's rocks, the planet offers one of its clearest reflections on how quickly worlds can change and how life responds when they do. This is why America matters to this story. Not because it was unique in experiencing the end, but because it allows that end to be understood, not as myth or spectacle, but as a sequence of real events that reshaped a living world, and in doing so, reshaped everything that followed. As the story widens beyond the final days of dinosaurs, it naturally settles into a longer view of Earth itself, a planet shaped not only by slow change, but by rare moments when the rules abruptly shift. The extinction that ended the age of dinosaurs was not an isolated accident in an otherwise gentle history. Earth has experienced several mass extinctions, each different in cause and character, each reshaping life in ways that echoed for millions of years. These events were separated by vast stretches of time, long enough for life to rebuild complexity again and again, yet close enough to remind us that stability is never permanent. Some extinctions unfolded through prolonged stress, drawn out over thousands or millions of years. Shifts in climate, rising or falling oxygen levels, massive volcanic activity, and changing sea levels slowly narrowed the conditions life depended on. Ecosystems frayed under pressure, species disappeared unevenly, and survivors adapted gradually to altered worlds. Other extinctions arrived more suddenly, driven by rapid environmental disruption that allowed little time for adjustment. The end of the dinosaurs belongs to this rarer category, defined not by gradual decline, but by abrupt interruption. What makes this event stand apart is its combination of speed and reach. The trigger arrived from beyond Earth, but its consequences were amplified by the planet's own systems. Fire, darkness, ecological collapse, and energy loss unfolded in sequence, transforming a single impact into a global biological reset. It was not simply a collision, it was a chain reaction that moved through atmosphere, ocean, land, and living systems without pause. This combination of factors makes it unlike most other extinction events, which tend to rely on one dominant driver rather than many working together. Because of this, scientists now watch the sky with a level of attention that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. Modern impact monitoring has transformed the unknown into something measurable. Telescopes track near-Earth objects, mapping their paths with increasing precision. Space agencies catalog asteroids and comets, calculating future trajectories decades and even centuries ahead. Most objects pass safely by. Some burn harmlessly in the atmosphere. A very small number warrant continued observation, not because danger is imminent, but because awareness reduces surprise. This monitoring does not exist to create fear, it exists to preserve time. The extinction that ended the dinosaurs succeeded in part because it arrived without warning. Today, even limited notice could change outcomes dramatically. Deflection technologies, still in development, rely on years of preparation rather than last moments. The difference between catastrophe and survival may lie not in power, but in foresight. Yet it is important to recognize that impacts are only one part of Earth's larger story. Climate change, ocean chemistry, and biological disruption continue to shape life, just as they always have. What makes the dinosaur extinction unique is not that it happened, but that it combined sudden force with prolonged environmental consequence. Darkness lasted long enough to collapse food webs. Energy loss persisted beyond the initial disaster. The event rewrote the rules faster than large life could respond. This matters when considering the present. Modern ecosystems are deeply interconnected, and like those of the past, they depend on stable energy flow. While the circumstances are different, the lesson remains consistent. Life thrives when conditions change slowly enough to allow adaptation. It struggles when change outpaces response. The dinosaurs did not vanish because they were weak. They vanished because the world changed faster than bodies of their size and complexity could adjust. The extinction that ended their reign was rare, but not impossible to repeat in some form. Earth moves through a dynamic solar system. Geological forces remain active. Life continues to balance on thresholds shaped by physics and chemistry. What has changed is awareness. For the first time, a species exists that can recognize these patterns while living within them. This does not grant control over nature, but it offers perspective. The story of the dinosaurs is not a warning written in fear. It is a record written in stone, showing how worlds can change, how dominance offers no guarantee, and how survival often belongs to those whose needs align with what remains. The uniqueness of this extinction lies not only in how it happened, but in how clearly it can now be understood. Could it happen again in exactly the same way? No two moments in Earth's history ever repeat themselves precisely. Could large-scale change reshape life once more? The planet's past suggests that transformation is not an exception, but part of its long rhythm. What follows such change, however, is never predetermined. Life rebuilds, adapts, and continues, not by preserving what was, but by responding to what is. In this understanding, the extinction of the dinosaurs becomes less a story of ending and more a chapter in Earth's ongoing ability to change, reset, and move forward, carrying life with it into forms no earlier age could have imagined. For more than 165 million years, dinosaurs shaped the living face of the planet. They witnessed continents pull apart and oceans open between them. They endured swings of climate, shifts in sea level, and the slow rearrangement of ecosystems that would have erased many other forms of life. Through it all, they adapted, diversified, and remained central to the world's structure. Their dominance was not brief or accidental. It was earned through resilience, innovation, and time. This length of rule can make extinction feel impossible in retrospect. When something persists for so long, it begins to seem permanent, woven into the planet itself. Dinosaurs were not visitors. They were architects of their environments. Forests grew under their movement. Rivers followed paths shaped by their migrations. Food webs organized themselves around their presence. The Earth they inhabited was, in many ways, a dinosaur world. Yet the stone tells a different lesson. Dominance does not fade slowly when it ends. It does not announce its weakness ahead of time. The dinosaurs did not lose their place because they were failing or declining. Their ecosystems were rich, balanced, and productive until they were not. The shift from success to absence did not take millions of years. It unfolded across a span of time so short it fits within a thin line of sediment. In geological terms, dominance vanished almost instantly. This contrast is one of the most striking patterns preserved in the rock record. Beneath the boundary, life is dense, complex, and confident. Above it, the world is quiet, reduced, and uncertain. There is no long transition between these states. The difference is abrupt, sharp enough to divide eras. A reign measured in tens of millions of years ended without ceremony, undone not by competition, but by circumstance. What the fossils reveal is that dominance is always conditional. It depends on the stability of the systems that support it. Dinosaurs thrived because the world delivered abundant energy through sunlight, plants, and predictable cycles. When that flow was interrupted, even briefly, the advantages that had once sustained them became liabilities. Large bodies, long development times, and specialized roles could not adapt quickly enough to a planet that had changed its rules. This fragility is not unique to dinosaurs. It is a property of life itself. Every dominant group in Earth's history has risen within a particular set of conditions. When those conditions shift beyond certain limits, dominance dissolves, regardless of past success. The stone records this pattern again and again, written not as judgment, but as consequence. What makes the dinosaur extinction especially instructive is how complete the transformation was. The creatures that followed did not inherit the same roles. The world rebuilt itself around different strategies: smaller bodies, faster reproduction, and greater flexibility. Complexity returned, but it expressed itself in new ways. The earth did not restore what it had lost. It moved forward. The lessons preserved here are quiet, but profound. Longevity does not guarantee permanence. Adaptation works only within the bounds of available time and energy. Systems that appear stable can fail rapidly when pushed beyond their thresholds. These truths are not warnings delivered by voice or intention. They are observations etched into stone by natural processes that operate without awareness. The fragility of dominance does not diminish the dinosaur's legacy. If anything, it deepens it. Their long reign stands as evidence of how successful life can be when conditions allow. Their sudden disappearance shows how quickly those allowances can be withdrawn. Together, these facts offer a fuller understanding of Earth's character, a planet capable of supporting extraordinary continuity and equally capable of reshaping itself without pause. In the layers beneath our feet, the story remains intact. A world built over millions of years, erased in a geological instant. A reminder that power in nature is never absolute, only temporary, balanced on conditions that can change faster than evolution can respond. The stone does not mourn this loss, it records it. And in doing so, it offers a lasting perspective on how life rises, rules, and eventually yields, not because it is weak, but because the earth itself is always changing. Long after the last dinosaurs vanished and the land reshaped itself into something new, their presence did not truly leave. It settled downward into soil and stone, becoming part of the ground itself. Across North America, dinosaur fossils rest beneath places that now feel entirely removed from deep time. They lie under cities threaded with roads and lights, beneath farms where crops rise and fall with the seasons, below rivers redirected by human hands. The past is not distant here. It is layered quietly beneath the present, close enough to touch, though rarely seen. In many regions, The distance between modern life and dinosaur bone is measured not in miles, but in meters. A field that appears ordinary at the surface may cover sediments once walked by herds. A suburban neighborhood may sit atop floodplains that preserved tracks and teeth long before houses existed. Even city centers, built of steel and concrete, sometimes rest directly above ancient river systems that buried remains with patient precision. The land did not clear itself of its history before welcoming new inhabitants. It simply added more layers. This closeness reshapes how the past is understood. Dinosaurs are often imagined as distant, separated from the present by an unbridgeable gulf of time. Yet in America, that gulf is thin. Excavations reveal bones where shopping centers now stand. Road cuts expose rock layers that capture entire ecosystems frozen in motion. Construction sites pause when fossils surface, reminding the modern world that it is built upon something far older and far quieter. Farms offer a similar intimacy with deep time. Plowed fields turn over soil that once held plant matter eaten by dinosaurs. Irrigation channels sometimes cut through sediment rich with fossil fragments. Farmers occasionally find teeth or bone fragments at the edges of their land, objects that feel out of place until their age is understood. These discoveries do not interrupt daily life for long, but they add a subtle awareness that the ground carries stories beyond the current season. This layering gives America a unique texture, not only geographically, but temporally. The continent holds many worlds stacked atop one another, each shaped by different rules and rhythms. The dinosaur world remains present not as a living system, but as a foundation. Its rivers determined where sediment accumulated. Its mountains influenced erosion and exposure. Its extinction shaped the landscapes that followed, indirectly guiding where soils formed and where rivers would later flow. Even the shape of modern ecosystems reflects this inheritance. Plains that once supported massive herbivores became fertile ground for grasses and agriculture. River valleys that preserved bones became corridors for human settlement. The same conditions that allowed dinosaurs to thrive and then be buried also favored preservation, uplift, and eventual discovery. The land remembers, even when those living upon it do not. What makes this legacy quiet is its patience. Fossils do not announce themselves. They wait. Millions of years pass without disturbance. Then, a storm erodes a hillside. A road is cut through stone, or a foundation is dug, and the past emerges briefly into the present. These moments are not dramatic in the way extinctions were. They are gentle reminders, offering glimpses rather than revelations. This proximity also reframes extinction itself. The end of the dinosaurs did not erase them from the world, it changed how they exist within it. They moved from motion to memory, from living presence to geological record. Their bones became part of the land's structure, influencing how it would later be shaped and understood. In this way, extinction did not remove dinosaurs from America. It embedded them more deeply within it. America, then, is not a single landscape. It is a layered world where time stacks rather than replaces. The modern surface rests on ancient foundations, and beneath each step lies a long sequence of lives that once moved, fed, and endured. This layering creates continuity rather than separation. The present does not float above the past. It grows directly from it. When people walk through cities, fields, and forests, they move across the compressed history of life itself. The quiet legacy beneath their feet does not demand attention, but it offers perspective. It shows how worlds end without vanishing entirely, how life transforms rather than disappears, and how the earth carries its memories forward even as it builds something new on top of them. The dinosaurs are gone, but they are not absent. They remain where they fell, folded into the land, shaping America not through dominance, but through depth. When the long arc of this story finally settles, what remains is not a tale of failure, but one of circumstance. The last dinosaurs of America were not weak, outdated, or fading relics of a world already moving on. They were successful animals living in functioning ecosystems, supported by landscapes that had sustained them for millions of years. Their extinction was not the result of poor adaptation or gradual decline. It was the result of timing, physics, and a sequence of events that arrived faster than even the most resilient life could respond. For 165 million years, dinosaurs adapted to shifting continents, changing climates, and evolving ecosystems. They survived challenges that reshaped oceans and atmospheres. They diversified into countless forms, filling nearly every ecological role available on land. By any biological measure, they were among the most successful groups of animals the planet has ever known. Their end does not erase that success. It stands alongside it, a reminder that endurance does not guarantee immunity. The forces that ended their reign were indifferent. Gravity guides a body through space. Energy released itself upon impact. Heat rose, light dimmed, and food webs unraveled according to rules that apply everywhere in the universe. Physics does not negotiate with biology, it simply unfolds. The dinosaurs happened to exist at the moment when those forces converged, when a stable world was pushed beyond its limits in a span too brief for recovery. In this light, extinction becomes less a judgment and more a turning of pages. The dinosaurs did not lose a competition. They encountered a boundary written by conditions rather than competitors. Their size, dominance, and specialization were strengths in the world they inherited, but those same traits could not be reshaped quickly enough when that world changed abruptly. Their story reminds us that life is always adapted to the present, never to every possible future. What followed their disappearance was not emptiness forever, but transformation. The world they left behind became the foundation for everything that came next. Mammals expanded into open roles. Birds carried forward a living thread of dinosaur lineage. Plants reshaped landscapes. Ecosystems rebuilt themselves along new paths, guided by the absence of giants and the opportunities that absence created. The modern world did not rise in spite of the dinosaurs' end. It rose because of it. The ground beneath North America still holds this history. Fossils lie beneath cities and fields, reminders that the present is layered directly atop deep time. Every step across the continent crosses ancient floodplains, forests, and coastlines shaped by lives long gone. The world we inhabit was not created in isolation. It was shaped by loss as much as survival, by endings as much as beginnings. There is a quiet humility in this realization. Dominance, even when sustained for millions of years, is temporary. Stability, even when it feels permanent, is conditional. The earth supports life generously, but it does not promise continuity in any single form. Change is not an interruption of its story, it is the story. The dinosaurs' final days were not dramatic because they lacked meaning. They were dramatic because they were ordinary until they were not. Life continued as it always had, right up to the moment when the rules shifted beyond recognition. That contrast gives their story its weight. It shows how quickly worlds can change and how deeply those changes shape everything that follows. In remembering the last dinosaurs, what endures is not tragedy alone, but perspective. Their extinction reminds us that life's success is measured not only by how long it lasts, but by how it shapes what comes after. The world we inherited, filled with forests, birdsong, mammals, and eventually human curiosity, is inseparable from the moment their world ended. Their legacy is written not only in stone, but in the living systems that grew from the space they left behind. In that sense, the dinosaurs did not vanish into nothing. They became part of the long, continuous process that turns endings into beginnings, carrying Earth forward into forms no single age could ever foresee.